Chapter 2792. The vigilance of these clones was naturally extremely important to them, and it was even related to their life and death. However, on the whole, their vigilance seemed a little ridiculous. At the very least, their vigilance didn't produce any effect at this time, because the attention of the heaven and earth founders wasn't on their clones at all. Now, what the heaven and earth founders were more concerned about was the changes in the world due to their probing. What the probing required was the feedback of the party being probed. What this feedback revealed was the secret of the party being probed. It was also what the probing needed to find out at this time, although their probing methods had already triggered the corresponding changes in the world of laws, causing all kinds of subtle changes in the world of laws. To these heaven and earth founders, to a certain extent, had already achieved the result they wanted. Under such circumstances, how could they possibly have the mood to pay attention to the reactions of the clones at this time? Many concepts continuously gathered towards the will left behind by the clones of the heaven and earth founders. In the blink of an eye, the embryonic form of the world of laws had already formed within these will. The heaven and earth founders' probing of the world of laws was ultimately just a probe, and they didn't intend to input their own world of laws into the world of laws. Therefore, the concepts that they input into the world of laws according to the plan occupied a considerable proportion of their own world of laws. However, in the end, it was only a proportion. Even if all the concepts were gathered together, they could at most form a broken view of the world. It was impossible to turn it into a complete view of the world. Moreover, at this time, not all of these concepts had gathered, but only a portion of them were gathering towards the location of the will. As a result, these concepts could only barely form the embryonic form of the world of laws and appear at the location of the will of the heaven and earth founders' avatars. Those wills were inwardly shocked by this change. No matter what, they were the clones of the heaven and earth founders, so they were naturally quite clear about the logic of the heaven and earth founders and their own thoughts. Under such circumstances, they naturally couldn't be more clear about the way of thinking of their main bodies. No matter how they looked at it, the situation in front of them didn't make sense. Is he crazy? Allowing me to gather the world of laws? This self-sacrifice doesn't seem like something the main body would do. This was what the wills thought. The wills of the creators of heaven and earth had their thoughts running wild, and they had no idea what was going on outside. However, not knowing what was happening outside wasn't enough to stop them from taking action. While being vigilant against the conspiracy of their original bodies, they worked hard to perfect themselves, trying hard to incorporate those ideas into the embryonic form of their own worldview. Compared to the huge difference in worldviews between other living beings, the difference in worldviews between their main bodies and their clones was much smaller. As a result, some of the concepts of the world's founders could be directly applied to the worldview of these incarnations without any modification. This was clearly the fundamental reason why these wills were using those concepts to form the embryonic form of their worldviews. Of course, a portion was a portion. Since it was only a portion, it was obvious that these wills could not be copied completely. There were many concepts that they had to distinguish one by one, and some of them even had to be modified accordingly before they could be used. If this process was skipped and they absorbed it without distinguishing it, it would obviously be directly distorting their own worldviews that these wills hated the most. After all, they were the incarnations of the world's founders, so it wasn't difficult for them to construct the embryonic form of their worldviews. The entire process wasn't too complicated. Soon, they completed the process. However, compared to the embryonic form of their worldviews, there were no shortcuts to truly perfecting their worldviews. It required the continuous construction of concepts and the expansion of the embryonic form of their worldviews. The complexity was simply indescribable. The embryonic form of the worldview could still rely on one's own experience to take a shortcut. When it came to perfecting the worldview, there was no other way. Even if these wills were the former incarnations of the world's founders, and they had a lot of memories and experiences of the world's founders, it was still the same. But is this world really going to ignore this? Another incarnation of the world's founders felt uneasy at this moment. One had to know that when these incarnations entered this world, the heavenly Tao incarnation had made an agreement with their main bodies that these incarnations couldn't bring anything with them. This was the same for their main bodies' power and worldviews. It was precisely because they couldn't bring these things with them that they had to pay attention to the many concepts transmitted by their main bodies. Otherwise, if they had all the memories of their main bodies, wouldn't these concepts have already been lying in the depths of their memories? If necessary, he just had to extract it from his memories. Why would they still need their main bodies to transmit their concepts over? The fact that the incarnation of the heavenly Tao had made such an agreement clearly showed that this world needed them to have such restrictions. But now, their actions were clearly in violation of the original request of the incarnation of the heavenly Tao. In this case, what would the incarnation of the heavenly Tao say? What would the world say? This was something worth pondering. These wills were secretly bewildered, and they were at a loss for the future. However, they clearly weren't the main characters of this world at this moment. At this moment, whether it was the heavenly Tao or the many worlds' founders, none of them were paying attention to them. At this moment, the attention of the many worlds' founders was focused on the overall changes in the world of laws. As for the heavenly Tao, it was focused on the various changes in their worldviews due to the outside world at this moment. Compared to this, everything else was simply secondary, and they couldn't even occupy any position in their perception at all. Has it finally begun? Let me see how you guys plan to deal with the natural counterattack of this worldview. At this moment, such a thought flashed through the heavenly Tao's mind. The effort to perfect his worldview had long since exhausted him mentally and physically. At this time, being able to personally witness the various subtle changes in the worldview and the collision of worldviews was also a rare inspiration for him. At this moment, he had the intention to move a small stool over to watch this battle that was happening on a different level. At this moment, the world's founders only felt an increasingly strong sense of uneasiness emerging from the bottom of their hearts. When these world's founders decided to test the world of laws, they had already made up their mind. It was a kind of determination. Even if they had to suffer the backlash of the world of laws, even if they were targeted by the world's rulers, they had to come to a conclusion. And the situation at this moment was almost telling them that their determination had already been put to use. At this moment, the situation they were encountering was the worst that they could have imagined. In other words, for any world's founders, they felt that the plan they had chosen wasn't the correct one that could probe the specific situation of the world of laws. In this way, the uneasiness in their hearts could naturally be imagined. Even if they had the determination to pay the price and bear the backlash, it was impossible for them to really not feel anything when the damage came. The world of laws itself was an existence that was much more perfect than the worldview of other worlds' founders. At this time, when the world of laws was invaded by external forces, it began to instinctively reject similar concepts that didn't belong to its own worldview. Of course, as a world, it naturally couldn't only have one worldview. Even if the world was created based on a worldview, since it was created, it had already broken away from the shackles of a worldview. This sounded very unbelievable, but if one looked at it from another perspective, it couldn't be more natural. A complete world, even if it was created according to an imperfect worldview, would inevitably give birth to living beings. And the views of living beings on heaven and earth and the world were obviously different. The views of heaven and earth and the world were actually a kind of worldview. It was just that ordinary living beings didn't sort them out and didn't turn them into their own cultivation standards or their own behavior standards, which was why they didn't have much power. Different living beings, no matter how similar they were or how similar the environment they grew up in, would form different worldviews. Even if they were in the same world, it was still the same. It was the same for the world of laws. The number of living beings in the world of laws could be said to be endless, and even if it was calculated in billions of trillions, it might not necessarily be able to describe it clearly. With so many living beings, one could imagine the variety of worldviews that could be formed. Even if these worldviews were more or less similar to the world of laws because of the influence of the world of laws, differences were still different. Even if there was a difference of 1 in a trillion, it would still be a different worldview. Under such circumstances, if the world of laws couldn't accept the existence of other worldviews, wouldn't it erase all living beings? Obviously, such a thing would not happen. Therefore, any world would be tolerant of other worldviews. As long as different worldviews didn't challenge the foundation of the world, the arrangement and control of the world would be able to tolerate it. Under such circumstances, the worldviews of the foreign world founders naturally wouldn't leave the world of laws after being rejected by the world of laws. Instead, they would head towards places that weren't important in the world of laws and wouldn't affect the essence of the world of laws or even the main body of the world of laws. At this time, in the world of laws, there were many parallel locations. In order to reach those parallel locations, one had to first pass through the connection between the many parallel locations. In other words, they had to pass through the will left behind by the former incarnations of the world founders. This was also the reason why the incarnations of the world founders could obtain so many concepts. However, it could also be seen from the previous statements that the absorption of those concepts by those incarnations was limited. The concepts that they could absorb were only a very small part of the many concepts that converged towards them. They might be able to absorb a large number of other concepts in the future, but for the time being, they couldn't integrate them into the embryonic form of their own worldviews that had just taken shape. However, these concepts couldn't disappear into thin air. If they weren't absorbed, they would naturally need to find a new way out. And that way out was obviously connected to those incarnations of the world's will. In other words, in the world of laws, there were several parallel locations that were connected to the incarnations of the world. Even though these concepts were only simple concepts, they had been refined and organized by the founders of the world for countless years, and they were already close to the Tao. When such a concept appeared in the world, it would naturally lead to many changes. Whether it was energy or matter, time or space, or laws, they would all be affected by those concepts and produce all kinds of corresponding changes. At this time, the parallel locations where those concepts converged were no exception. As many concepts continued to move towards those parallel locations gradually began to undergo all kinds of changes that couldn't be described in word. These changes made those parallel locations faintly have many new possibilities. Of course, these new possibilities naturally didn't need to be mentioned at this time. The most obvious phenomenon caused by this change was none other than the fact that the connection between those parallel locations and other parallel locations seemed to have been greatly strengthened. In fact, some of the parallel locations even gave people a feeling that the two had completely fused, and the gap between them had been completely removed. Along with this change, the incarnations of the world founders had an inexplicable feeling, as if they had the possibility of regaining freedom. Chapter 2793. These wills had originally fused with the world of laws and turned into a mechanism of the world of laws. Obviously, they had almost lost the characteristics of being free wills. In fact, they sometimes even suspected that their wills might just be a phenomenon in the operation of the world of laws. Under such circumstances, they naturally couldn't talk about freedom at all. And according to the current development of the situation, there might be a turning point for things. If this trend continued to develop, they might be able to truly condense their own worldview. This worldview might be much more interconnected than the worldview of the main body, but it was already enough to become the foundation of one's self. Once this worldview took shape, They could no longer only rely on the world of laws and think and act according to the restrictions of the world of laws, and this, in addition to the small worlds that were born based on the embryonic form of their own worldview, simply complemented all the conditions for the creators of the world to live freely in the simulated state of chaos. In this way, they could almost completely break free from the restrictions of the world of laws and truly obtain the freedom that they had been looking forward to. How could they not be excited about this? It's just like a predetermined setting. At this moment, some wills had inexplicable doubts in their hearts. Everything in front of them seemed to be a pure coincidence, a simple accumulation of various conditions. But in the end, they converged into a result that was of great benefit to them. It was as if all these circumstances existed only to bring them benefits. No matter how one looked at it, this situation was a little strange. This also made the more cautious wills feel that something was wrong and inexplicable uneasiness arose in their hearts. However, it was obvious that no matter what, these wills weren't lacking in ambition. In the face of such a situation that could obviously bring them huge benefits, how could they possibly ignore the possible dangers and schemes? At this time, even if they had inexplicable doubts and uneasiness in their hearts, they still continued without hesitation. On one hand, they adjusted themselves and worked hard to integrate the corresponding concepts into the embryonic form of their own worldview. On the other hand, they also tried their best to adjust the concepts that they couldn't absorb and could only integrate into the parallel worlds connected by their wills. They tried their best to build and condense those concepts according to the trend of their own worldview. In this process, the embryonic form of their own worldview began to grow continuously. The areas that seemed to be separated from the many parallel worlds that were integrated with their wills also became more and more unique and separated from the outside world. Due to the adjustments made by Luo Fan back then, the many parallel worlds of the world of laws were actually on the same level as the main body of the world. Such changes couldn't only be sensed by sensing the parallel worlds, but could also be seen by looking at them. At a glance from the transportation network layer, one could directly see that in the image of the constantly changing world that seemed to be growing, stars of other colors had begun to appear. These stars constantly flickered with an inexplicable light, and in the process of this flickering, there seemed to be some invisible existence constantly gathering towards the spots of light, making the spots of light brighter and brighter. At the same time, in the many worlds of the transportation network layer, the world founders who sensed this change could all sense an aura that they were familiar with from those spots of light. It was as if it had been separated from their bodies, yet it was already different from them. It was as if it had become a complete body part of itself. What's going on? What the hell are these? These world founders had such doubts in their hearts. They had some guesses, but they didn't dare to believe their guesses. In the world of laws, existences that could give them the same feeling did indeed exist. And that was their avatars. As their avatars, they were originally like a part of their bodies, and could be considered as part of their bodies. Before this, they gave up on these avatars and completely cut off the connection between them and themselves. This was like giving these body parts freedom. After that, these avatars became independent and became complete on their own. Obviously, it was like their body parts had become complete. It could be said that if they substituted their avatars, the various complicated feelings they felt would all be explained. However, they didn't dare to believe their guesses. There was no other reason than the fact that what was happening in the world of laws at this time was clearly that those existences had begun to obtain considerable authority in the world of laws. They had begun to gradually break away from the restrictions of being just a living being, and had begun to gradually reveal their existence to the entire world of laws. Even if this happened to the native creatures of the world of laws, it would be enough to turn the world upside down. It was almost comparable to a slave turning over and becoming the master. If this happened to their avatars, wouldn't it be like an enemy directly robbing the property of their master? It would be understandable if this happened in a place without a master, but it simply subverted their worldview when it happened in the world of laws. It can't be that he has already left, right? At this moment, a world founder suddenly had such a ridiculous thought. However, he quickly discarded this ridiculous idea. After all, this was a simulated state of chaos. Here, where else could the world founders go apart from their own world? Even those simulated chaotic layers required the participation of the world as a unit. Without the world, what were the world founders worth? As a result, the world founders rejected the correct answer without any hesitation. After eliminating the correct answer, the more they thought about it, the more ridiculous and inexplicable the results they obtained were. In the world of laws, the heavenly Tao already knew that there was no need for it to worry about anything that happened to the world of laws. Now, the natural reaction of the world of laws was more than enough to deal with the external invasion. At the very least, the world of laws could be considered to be able to sit back and relax for this time's test. As for what the situation would be like next time, it could only be discussed next time. Hence, it simply began to enter the process of perfecting the embryonic form of its own world. It was the style of not caring about anything that concerned itself to the extreme. This time, the test of the world founders on the world of laws passed unknowingly. They had considered for so long and established 18 plans, but in the end, none of them achieved results that they could accept. In fact, it even had the opposite effect. They used these 18 plans to test the world of laws in order to find out the truth of the world of laws. However, after this test, they found that the world of laws became more and more unfathomable in their eyes. The situation inside seemed to be shrouded in a dense fog. This situation was truly like punching cotton to the many pioneers of the world. They felt like they had used the wrong strength. Is this disdain or powerlessness? After all the test plans were over, many world founders were confused. What they were confused about was naturally not the result of the test, but rather the fact that they hadn't received any warning at all, nor did they receive any counterattacks. Their previous tests of the world of laws didn't trigger any feedback from the world of laws at all. It felt as if the world of laws didn't care about any of their tests at all. How could this not make them feel bewildered? If they were on their own, if an outsider came to test their world and their own strength, they would definitely retaliate with their strongest strength at the first possible moment. They would directly let the outsider feel how big of a mistake it was to offend them. However, the world of laws didn't take any action because of this. It didn't give them any warning or punishment at all. This was completely contrary to their understanding. In the spiritual network, many thoughts were transmitted to each other, constantly discussing the current situation. This kind of discussion naturally couldn't come to a conclusion. The reaction of the world of laws was already there for all to see. Any creator of the world would be able to see it clearly. What a world founder could sense, other world founders could also sense. What a world founder couldn't see, other world founders generally wouldn't be able to see either. In this way, this kind of discussion was like completely ignorant existences discussing with each other to establish the outline of something that was beyond their understanding. It went without saying how small the possibility of success was. As they discussed like this, time gradually passed. Before they knew it, another few decades had passed. During these few decades, the many world founders didn't come up with a result that everyone agreed on. In the end, they only decided on their next course of action. This course of action had actually been determined when the results came out a few decades ago. Since the world of laws didn't impose punishment on them and didn't attack them because of their tests, then of course they could become bolder. Of course, although they could become bolder, it didn't mean that they could do whatever they wanted. It didn't mean that they could completely ignore all rules and carry out tests. It must be known that although the last test wasn't punished or counterattacked, their previous tests had triggered a violent reaction from the other party every time. If they really didn't care about the tolerance range of the world of laws and randomly carried out all kinds of tests, the final result would probably be very regrettable. Such a restriction was naturally nothing to the many pioneers of the world. After all, these world founders were extraordinary themselves, and their grasp of speed could be said to be superb. They had already tried the tests that were punished, and they had also tried the tests that weren't punished. This was equivalent to delineating a division, and the next tests could naturally be carried out in those divisions at will. Next, they began to establish hundreds of plans. This time, they didn't plan to divide these hundreds of plans according to the original method, but to carry them out at the same time. The reason why they had to split up and carry out one of the 18 plans each was because they didn't know how strong the counterattack of the world of laws would be. Everyone was deducing based on the premise that they only had one chance. But now, after confirming that the world of laws disdained their probing and wouldn't retaliate against them, the situation was naturally completely different. Since the other party wouldn't counterattack, they could naturally have multiple chances. Since there were so many times, he naturally needed to strengthen each test as much as possible so that he could get as much results as possible from each test. Thus, they naturally made the choice to do everything they could to the extreme every time they tried to test the waters. Moreover, to carry out every test to the extreme, this obviously required sufficient manpower, and also required sufficient intelligence to be able to achieve this. Therefore, the final result was that these hundreds of plans gathered all the world founders who participated in the plan. Everyone gave these plans a number and began to implement them one by one according to the number. In terms of perfection alone, these plans naturally couldn't compare to the 18 plans they had previously chosen. After all, if these plans could be compared to the 18 plans, they wouldn't have only chosen those 18 plans back then. However, compared to the 18 plans, these hundreds of plans had an advantage, and that was that they involved more aspects and were more complicated. The 18 plans could be said to be a kind of specialization, but these hundreds of plans were already casting a wide net. It was only when such tests went unpunished that they dared to take out these hundreds of plans. Otherwise, no matter how bold they were, they wouldn't have come up with such a plan that wasn't very perfect to court death. The first plan was quickly prepared by the world founders and was put into action. Chapter 2795. Of course, that was just paying attention. While these beings appeared to be rather intelligent, they did not have much of an organization. It was difficult to believe how clear they were about the situation in this part of the world. At this time, Luo Fan felt that the most important thing to do was to figure out the specific details of this tribulation world. Other things could be delayed and looked at later. Under the influence of this absolute goal, it didn't take long for Luo Fan to find a place where intelligent beings lived that suited his goal. This settlement was located on a plain where various tribulation-triggering points formed a strange balance with each other. If this plain was in a normal world, it would definitely be a dangerous place. Even powerful cultivators would not be willing to stay there for long. After all, this place was the land itself, and it was constantly changing. Some places that were extremely peaceful and peaceful at one moment would turn into dangerous places like magma seas in the next. Furthermore, this was only the most ordinary of changes. There were countless changes that were more severe, terrifying, and incomprehensible than this. However, in this part of the world, this place was already a rare place of peace. At the very least, there would not be any sudden collapse of space and time, or an abrupt break in time that separated different parts of the living beings into two different periods of time. Evidently, Luo Fan was not the only one who thought so. The intelligent beings in this part of the world thought so as well. Thus, a place where intelligent life forms resided had appeared. Moreover, it was not just a group of intelligent beings that lived here. There were quite a number of living beings that lived here. These intelligent creatures occupied various parts of this inhabited area, occupying locations that were comparatively calmer and more balanced compared to the plains situation. Just by looking at the distribution of buildings in the settlement of intelligent beings, one could tell that these races were not on good terms. The various defensive and offensive structures were clearly not designed to deal with the natural changes in this settlement. The reason why Luo Fan was certain that the intelligent beings in this settlement could satisfy his requirements was because of these defensive and offensive structures. The mysteries contained within these structures were definitely something that could only be built by a race of beings with relatively high intelligence and a deep understanding of the world. Such a creature's understanding of the world would certainly meet the requirements that Luo Fan wanted to understand. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan had already landed at the nearest settlement of intelligent creatures. This settlement wasn't built like a town in a normal world. Instead, the entire settlement seemed to exist in a chaotic but rather mysterious state. Many of the residents had their own buildings, and the distance between these buildings and other buildings was not set according to the requirements of the settlement. Instead, it was set according to the surrounding environment. Every building was at the balance of many points of calamity, and was at the point where the powers of many points of calamity intersected. It could be said that every building was the core of an incredibly subtle formation. The many buildings supported and interacted with each other, forming an even larger and more mysterious system. This system seemed to be a formation, but it also seemed to be a simple dynamic balance. There was some kind of indescribable communication between the many buildings at every moment. This communication caused the many buildings to be closely connected, and they constantly released a strange power that could counter the endless changes. The endless changes in the outside world were obviously the changes caused by the countless points of calamity. It was also enough to make this part of the world endlessly dangerous, and completely unsuitable for the survival of living beings. The living beings in this settlement did not look like born Taoism aptitudes at all. At least, they did not look very similar to any of the born Taoism aptitudes that existed in the transportation network layer that Luo Fan knew. After all, the number of worlds that existed in the transportation network layer was counted in the hundreds of millions. If the number of worlds was counted in the hundreds of millions, then the types of born Taoism aptitudes would naturally also be counted in the hundreds of millions. Even with such a large base number, the living beings in this settlement were different from any of the other types. This was enough to show just how strange the living beings in this settlement were. Even the living beings in this settlement did not look exactly the same. In fact, the living beings in almost every building had a special characteristic. As long as they left the building, the appearance of the living beings would be fundamentally different. It was as if every building was a perfect world, and the living beings in every building were born Taoism aptitudes that belonged to that perfect world. In fact, this might not be an illusion, but it was very likely to be real. This was because when Luo Fan saw the living beings entering and exiting the buildings, their appearances changed quite a bit when they were inside and outside the buildings. The creatures that stepped into the building all had the same appearance, and a large number of them all had the same appearance. After leaving the buildings, the appearances of many living beings began to change. No matter how similar their original appearances were, they became huge in the blink of an eye. This appearance was extremely similar to the appearance of a cultivator who stepped into a perfect world and directly transformed into a perfect world with a born Taoism aptitude. Naturally, it was impossible for the living beings in this settlement to not notice Luo Fan's arrival. In fact, Luo Fan's arrival was like a drop of water dripping into boiling oil. The commotion caused was unimaginably huge. In just an instant, almost the entire settlement was completely activated. It was unknown how many gazes, how many perceptions, and how many forces were rapidly converging on Luo Fan's location. At the same time, even the many buildings in the settlement were undergoing various subtle adjustments, and they began to work hard to find a new balance. A new balance with Luo Fan's participation. The reason for this was very simple. It was because of the strange state that Luo Fan was in at this moment. One should not forget what kind of state Luo Fan was in at this moment. At this moment, He was in a state under the protection of the light of heaven and earth. And how was the light of heaven and earth protecting him? The light of heaven and earth was completely in response to the various changes that occurred in the outside world. It evolved corresponding changes to neutralize the changes, repulsion, oppression, and suppression of the outside world on Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, the changes of the light of heaven and earth could actually correspond to all the changes that occurred in the place where the light of heaven and earth came into contact with the light of heaven and earth. In other words, at this moment the area around Luo Fan could actually be counted as a place where the change of heaven and earth completely disappeared. In other words, the original function of this place as a part of the dynamic balance of the settlement had been eliminated. With this function eliminated, the original balance of the settlement was naturally greatly challenged. If this settlement wanted to regain its dynamic balance, then it had to adjust itself, find a new dynamic balance. With this, as soon as Luo Fan stepped into this settlement, every element that previously formed the dynamic balance of this settlement, every unit, had to find their own position in the new dynamic balance. It could even be said that if it wasn't for the fact that this settlement was extremely mysterious, where the balance of every single building could be adjusted at any time, just this sudden change might have been enough to destroy this settlement. It was precisely because of this that this current situation occurred. Just by stepping into this place, Luo Fan reacted like a drop of water falling into boiling oil. At this moment, Luo Fan did not feel any guilt because of this at all. Instead, he watched with great interest as this settlement underwent extremely complicated and subtle dynamic adjustments. Newcomer, welcome. However, you shouldn't have barged in so recklessly. At this moment, a figure arrived before Luo Fan, speaking in a language that Luo Fan was completely unfamiliar with. Even though this figure seemed a bit humanoid, it was only the general outline that resembled a human a bit. There were many concrete details that didn't have anything to do with the human form. It was to the extent where even the eyes, ears, mouth, and nose that normal people needed weren't a similar combination. Instead, they were constructed in a way that Luo Fan was completely unfamiliar with, a type of perception that only appeared in Luo Fan's imagination, but never truly existed. Even though it was a completely unfamiliar language, for existences at Luo Fan's level, as long as there was a language to express a specific meaning, no matter how niche the language was, they would be able to instantly grasp the meaning it was trying to express. Right now, it was naturally no exception. In reality, this type of ability was already an essential ability for creatures of a certain level and above. After all, different worlds followed different worldviews, so how could it be expected that the languages of the creatures would be the same? If such different existences didn't have such an ability to communicate, wouldn't it be impossible for the creatures of different worlds to understand each other? Obviously, this was, of course, impossible. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, "I was too rash, I hope your excellency can forgive me." Even though he didn't think that it was a mistake, nor did he feel any guilt because of it, he naturally wouldn't be stingy with words that could solve a problem that could be solved with a few gentle words. After hearing Luo Fan's words, the person seemed to be a little more satisfied and said, "But this isn't your fault. I think it's your first time encountering such a holy land, so it's understandable that you aren't used to the rules here. But now, you need to learn a lot of things before you can move around freely. It's just that all of us are adapting to you now. If you want to be accepted by us, you need to actively participate." Luo Fan rejoiced inwardly. This was like having a pillow when he was sleepy. He wanted to know the secrets of this world, and the other party wanted to impart the most precious knowledge of this world to him. Since that was the case, how could he refuse? He couldn't help but nod his head. To the residents of the settlement, it was a good thing that the settlement could grow stronger. In particular, the addition of Luo Fan, who seemed to be an extraordinary powerhouse, was the best of the best. After all, the situation in this plane was rather complicated. It wasn't like they didn't have any enemies here. The other settlements were obviously their enemies. While they were constantly spying on the other settlements, their settlements were also being spied on at all times. Under such circumstances, as an outsider, Luo Fan was obviously an extremely precious resource. If Luo Fan chose this settlement and was willing to work for it, it would be enough to strengthen the settlement. It might even be able to suppress the other settlements and directly conquer them. As for why they were so sure that Luo Fan was an expert and not an ordinary creature born in this world, the reason was simple. That was because Luo Fan had obviously come from outside the inhabited plains. This world was not like other ordinary worlds. Here, even this settlement was not a place where ordinary cultivators would be willing to stay for a long time. It was easy to imagine how dangerous it was outside the plains. And now, Luo Fan could come from the outside world, as if nothing had happened. He didn't even look the slightest bit disheveled. Was this not enough to show that he was an absolute expert? Therefore, at that moment, this person explained in detail how to build the buildings in the settlement, how to balance the environment of the settlement outside, how to adjust the buildings according to the environment, and how to rent the buildings in the settlement to maintain a dynamic balance to Luo Fan. Such explanations naturally couldn't come out of thin air. Instead, he had to explain why each preparation had to be like that. For example, why the buildings needed to take care of a special spacetime structure, or why the buildings needed to be suppressed in such a way because the buildings could give birth to living beings, and so on. Chapter 2796. These living beings were the living beings born in this world. Due to the special space-time structure of this world, even they did not know how long it had been since they were born. In their senses, this world seemed to have been born with their ancestors ever since it was born. When their ancestors were born, they were just like the other living beings in this world. They could only struggle to survive in this chaotic world. They struggled to stay alive through the changes in the world, and slowly found out the rules of the tribulations heaven and earth. They kept accumulating knowledge from generation to generation, until the last few generations of this creature were able to gain a stable foothold in the tribulations heaven and earth. In the end, they lived and multiplied here until now. Of course, at this point in time, this world was no longer as chaotic as it used to be. They had gradually comprehended a hidden essence that was different from the normal laws of the world. This essence allowed these beings to borrow the power of the world and use the changing laws of the world. They could even use the changing laws to obtain various kinds of power, allowing the essence of their lives to evolve. In other words, they had even found a cultivation path that was suitable for this world. Of course, this cultivation path was still rather crude for the time being. It was far from perfect, and it clearly required generations of hard work to improve it. It was just like how they built this settlement from scratch in the beginning. Fortunately, they were at a juncture where they needed manpower and wisdom to perfect their cultivation path. Otherwise, they would not have welcomed Luo Fan's arrival so warmly. After all, no matter what, he was an unfamiliar expert from the outside. Facing such an expert, ordinary living beings would definitely be doubtful and cautious. Just like now, they accepted without any misgivings and imparted the experience accumulated over generations without leaving out anything. Only their thirst for the strong was enough to suppress these suspicions and guard against the strong. Only then could it be possible. Adjusting himself to the dynamic balance of this settlement was naturally an extremely simple matter for Luo Fan. One must know that he was an existence that could directly form his own body. He could even create a new world in a simulated state of chaos. For such an existence, controlling and adjusting himself was almost an instinct. Just like what this person was teaching him right now, to adapt to the dynamic balance of the surrounding settlements so that he would no longer be a burden to this settlement, but instead become an organic part of this settlement. Even though it was complicated, it really wasn't too difficult of an adjustment. Such an adjustment was, of course, extremely simple for him, who had that kind of instinct. That person was soon shocked by the method that Luo Fan displayed. Although the adjustment was not too complicated, one must not forget that it was a method that generations of people had accumulated and created over an endless period of time. Normally, it would take them a few years to master such a method from scratch, no matter how talented they were. It was to the extent where it could be said that every single person here spent their youth trying to adapt to this inhabited land's dynamic balance. It was precisely because they knew that it was rather troublesome to complete such adjustments that the residents of this settlement did not impart the method to Luo Fan at once. Instead, they adjusted their own buildings and their interactions with their surroundings, taking the initiative to adapt to Luo Fan's arrival in this settlement. They first stabilized the place before trying to let Luo Fan learn this method. If they had known that Luo Fan could complete such adjustments so quickly, they would not have wasted so much effort. You really did it? In the end, when Luo Fan had regained his freedom, that person still asked in disbelief. I think you guys know the specifics better than me, right? Luo Fan only smiled faintly. He was in a rather wonderful mood at the moment. That was because through this method of adjustment and the various situations related to this world that the other party described, he had a general understanding of this world. Compared to before, when he was completely clueless about this world, it was already countless times better. Although he still could not understand the nature of this retribution world, and could not understand the nature of this retribution world, he had already taken a huge step in that direction. How could he not be satisfied? That's right, I should know better than you. That person could not help but laugh. Indeed, whether or not Luo Fan had perfectly integrated into the settlement system, whether or not he had re-established a dynamic balance with the settlement, this was something that only the original residents of the settlement knew better. At this moment, many people started to come out. These people had all sorts of strange appearances, and almost none of them looked the same as the others. In fact, there were very few similarities between them. As far as Luo Fan was concerned, almost none of these creatures could satisfy his aesthetic standards. However, similarly, in their eyes, Luo Fan's appearance obviously did not satisfy their aesthetic standards either. As for Luo Fan, he thought that his appearance was normal, while the others had all sorts of strange appearances. In their eyes, this perception was the opposite. However, in this world, in this settlement, there were just too many images that didn't satisfy one's sense of beauty. It was not a big deal to have one more person like Luo Fan. After a series of exchanges, Luo Fan told them his name. To these residents, the addition of Luo Fan was a great expansion of their strength. This caused the residents of this settlement to develop many desires for the other settlements on the plains. It was not easy to find a stable place that could establish dynamic balance in this world. In the eyes of these residents, the few places on this plane were the only ones in this world. The reason why these living beings could not reproduce to their heart's content and could not expand to their heart's content was because of the limitation of resources. Therefore, the residents of any settlement wished for the residents of other settlements to die so that they could occupy those settlements and turn them into their own resources so that they could reproduce to their heart's content and develop to their heart's content. Therefore, when they had enough strength, there was no doubt what their choice would be. Let's set off tomorrow. Jinghai Village has provoked us several times. We can't let them be arrogant anymore. A resident suggested. This resident's body structure was very special. It seemed to be made of bones and spikes. Overall, he looked very dangerous, and people could associate him with battles at a glance. Through the previous introduction, Luo Fan already knew that he was the most warlike person in this village. That's right, these settlements were villages. At the very least, to the living beings of this settlement, their settlement was a village. As for the other settlements, there were also many villages. Jinghai Village was the nearest village to this village. The name of this village was Jiwang Village. As for how it got its name, it was impossible to verify. This warlike person's name was Zhan Wu. The person who spoke to Luo Fan just now was the village chief of Jiwang village. His name was Morning. Morning just shook his head and said, "Don't be too anxious. They should be the ones who are anxious now. We just need to wait and see." He comforted Zhan Wu, and his expression did not change at all because of Zhan Wu's suggestion. Even this kind of comforting words seemed to come out of his mouth. He seemed to be very used to this kind of comforting words. "That's what you say every time." Zhan Wu was delighted. However, it was clear that this person had quite the authority in this Jiwang village. Even though he was already used to this kind of cajoling, he still did not dare to continue pestering him. He could only helplessly curl his lips and put this matter aside for now. "Did you only find this settlement plain after so many years? Is there no other place?" Luo Fan did not intend to participate in their conversation at this time and asked Morning instead. Morning just shook his head and said, "No. As far as we know, this is the only plain inhabited by humans. Apart from here, we don't have the ability to build a stable village anywhere else." "Then, why is it called a village?" Luo Fan only frowned. In the administrative system, a village was obviously the smallest unit. Beneath the village, there were no similar structures to be found. However, above the village there were small towns, cities, counties, and even bigger ones such as provinces, counties, and countries without those above. The saying of a village naturally did not have much meaning. With such a small population, if it's not a village, is it a country? Morning said helplessly. Naturally, he also wanted to be a king. He wanted to be an emperor, but there were only a few hundred households and they only occupied such a small settlement. They were even threatened by other settlements, so they could not settle down for a long time. In such a place, he could not call himself a king at all. Luo Fan was a little disappointed when he heard that. Then, is there really no bigger settlement above? He did not give up and asked. "Maybe there is, but I don't know," Morning said helplessly. At this moment, he could already feel that Luo Fan did not seem to be looking at the village. It seemed like there was no value in staying in the village. "No, there must be." At this moment, a voice came from outside the circle of people. This was a short creature with 6 arms and 4 legs. It had 4 eyes on its face, but it exuded a weak aura. "Depraved, don't bring out those vague legends and make a fool of yourself." Morning's expression turned inexplicably ugly as he shouted. His expression turned ugly, not because he could see it, but because he sensed it. After all, his appearance were completely different from Luo Fan's taste, so it was difficult to distinguish his expression at first glance. "No, that's not an illusory legend. It's history. That's true history." The man called Tome of Evil yelled at this moment. "Have you found any evidence after so many days? It's just a legend without any evidence." Morning was even more unhappy. Luo Fan's eyes lit up at this moment. "Friend Depraved, why don't you come in and have a good talk?" he immediately called out. Although he was only a newcomer in this village, his strength was enough for him to surpass the newcomer stage and gain a considerable say in this village. Although he called out to Depraved, he could not directly contradict him. At this moment, he could only frown and watch Depraved squeeze in. "You're the newcomer this time, right? Are you interested in higher-level settlements?" Depraved asked excitedly after seeing Luo Fan. "That's right, I'm very interested in higher-level settlements. Friend, do you have any clues?" Luo Fan asked directly. This was what he was really thinking, and he had no intention of hiding it from the others. Moreover, it did not seem like he could hide it. As long as he stayed here, the others would naturally be able to tell what he was thinking. "Don't be fooled by him, Luo Fan. That kind of thing is actually just an illusory legend. There has never been any evidence of the existence of a larger, higher-level settlement," Morning said hurriedly. There was a hint of anxiety in his words. That's right, Depraved is actually possessed by the devil. What he said is actually not credible. The others continued to chime in at this moment. Aren't you guys afraid that Luo Fan will find clues and abandon this village because of his powerful combat strength? How could you say such shameful things? Depraved shouted at this moment. We're shameful things? Don't you feel guilty saying that? Are you afraid that he will think that what you said is illusory and meaningless, so you deliberately emphasized the value of those words? Did you deliberately create those things here to prove that they really exist? Morning said angrily. However, although he was angry, Morning did not do anything to drive Depraved away. Obviously, this Depraved either had a special identity or special strength. Chapter 2797. Luo Fan was naturally happy to see them argue. After all, it was related to what he was looking for: the possible existence of settlements such as towns in this world. It would be best if he could figure out what he wanted to figure out during their argument. However, although he was happy to see them argue, it would be a little too much if the argument went beyond a certain limit and turned into a fight. Therefore, at this moment, seeing that they were getting more and more stiff and were about to fight, Luo Fan said, "Everyone, there's no need to argue. I'm interested in all legends. Even if there's a high possibility that it's fake, I won't reject it." Upon hearing this, Desolate's body froze. At this time, since he had already said so, there was naturally no need to continue arguing. Unless he wanted to fall out with Luo Fan, he could only let Evil Codex talk nicely. At this moment, Evil Codex had an inexplicable look of hope on his face. Obviously, he was not as confident in the so-called legend as he appeared to be. At this moment, he was still looking forward to getting some encouragement from Luo Fan. Desolate gave Evil Codex a warning look, as if he wanted him to stop talking nonsense. However, it was obvious that his warning was nothing to Evil Codex. Seeing that Evil Codex and Luo Fan were together, the other villagers were a little disappointed. However, they did not completely despair. At this time, they stayed by the side and waited for the development of the situation to see if Luo Fan would really be persuaded by Evil Codex and leave Jiwang village. Zhan Wu, who was at the side, wished that he could immediately pounce over and subdue Evil Codex to prevent such an outcome. Evil Codex looked around. Without doing anything, a strange wave surged out from his body and began to interact with the surrounding environment subtly. During this interaction, a subtle barrier gradually appeared between him and Luo Fan, separating them from the outside world. Faced with this action, Luo Fan only glanced at it and did not pay too much attention. After all, Evil Codex's behavior was at most cautious. He was not guarding against Lin Huang, but the villagers. In that case, why should he stop him? As for the villagers, they were on the verge of exploding. What did he mean by that? He clearly didn't trust them. There were a few impulsive ones who wanted to break the barrier. However, Morning was still more stable, and it stopped them from moving. The reason for this was naturally because he knew that there was no way to stop this anymore. What Luo Fan would decide in the future was up to him. Even if they found a way to stop the Book of Evil, would Luo Fan still be unable to figure out the legends? This was obviously impossible. Since those legends were legends, they naturally spread far and wide. How could they prevent others from knowing about something that had spread far and wide? At this time, if Evil Codex made things clear, he could still leave some friendship and let Luo Fan owe them a favor. But if he kept sabotaging and obstructing them, then there would be no friendship at all. At that time, perhaps Luo Fan would attack them out of anger. How could he do something like this that would create enmity in order to win over the other party? After the barrier appeared, they could not hear the conversation between Evil Codex and Luo Fan. Of course, if they wanted to, they could forcibly break through the barrier to find out and eavesdrop on them. However, it was like a person closing the door to his room. A door certainly could not stop someone with ulterior motives. However, if one really barged in recklessly, It would obviously offend that person, obviously. Morning and the others would not do such a thing. At this moment, they could only watch Evil Codex and Luo Fan have a long conversation inside the barrier. The flow of time in this world was an extremely strange state of existence. Even in this settlement that was already barely stable, it wasn't absolutely stable. Occasionally, there would be situations in this village where only one night had passed, but the outside world had already changed. Even the balance of the entire village had changed. Sometimes, there were even villagers who had been reborn from the future and time-traveled from the past. Under such circumstances, they had no idea how long Evil Codex and Luo Fan had been talking. Morning felt that they had only been talking for a few hours, but the people beside them felt that they had only been talking for a few breaths, while some felt that they had been talking for a few days. Evidently, even if they were standing in the same place, the flow of time between them was different. It was also because of this that they had no idea how long Evil Codex and Luo Fan had been talking. All they knew was that the barrier had gradually disappeared, and Evil Codex and Luo Fan appeared in front of them with a thoughtful look on their faces. Morning hurriedly cast aside his guesses about how long they had been talking to each other. He went forward and asked nervously, "So, Luo Fan, what's your decision?" Upon hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "I plan to stay in this village for some time and leave when the golden mist appears." Morning felt helpless and happy at the same time. He felt helpless because this meant that Luo Fan already knew about the legends, which meant that he could leave at any time. On the other hand, he was happy because this also proved that Luo Fan was willing to help this village for a period of time. The golden mist was a natural phenomenon in this world. Or perhaps it was a natural phenomenon that they knew. The time of this natural phenomenon was not fixed, but it would appear from time to time. When it appeared, the entire world within their field of vision would be shrouded in the golden mist. This golden mist had an extremely unique nature. It seemed to be time, space, rules, and laws. It could be seen, but no matter what method was used, it could not be touched. It was impossible to determine how long this golden mist could last. Perhaps the time it appeared was fixed, but in this world, even if two existences were standing face to face, their time could not be equated. Under such circumstances, it was a mystery how long the golden mist had been present in the sky. According to the ancient legends, when the golden mist appeared, a path would be opened. This path would lead to an incredibly vast continent. That continent was more stable than any place in the world that they knew of. There were countless living beings that formed countries and created incredible cultivation civilizations. It was said that some powerhouses had transcended the world and could destroy the world with a finger. Since ancient times, countless people had explored the golden mist and left behind many legends that were unknown whether they were true or false. However, according to those records, even those who were closest to that path could only see its shadow from afar. No one had actually stepped into it. Moreover, those existences that explored the golden mist seemed to have been stimulated by something after their exploration. They did not care about anything outside the golden mist, and only wanted to pursue the path in the golden mist and the vast continent behind it. This kind of existence was obviously an existence that was despised by the people in this inhabited area. After all, to this settlement, cooperation was the norm. This kind of cooperation was necessary for survival. On the other hand, those that did not cooperate with others and only wanted to pursue illusory legends were obviously just burdens and would naturally be despised. Evil Codex, for example, was obviously such an existence. If not for the fact that Evil Codex knew his own limits and did not blindly explore the golden mist, and was occasionally willing to help Jiwang village fight against other villages, he might have been abandoned long ago. Previously, the conversation between Luo Fan and Evil Codex was about the many records and legends. Since Evil Codex wanted to pursue the path behind the golden mist, he naturally paid great attention to information about it. In fact, the information he gathered was many times more than what Luo Fan had expected. If he were to describe it in words, the information would probably be counted in the hundreds of millions. Their conversation did not last as long as the people outside thought. Instead, it only lasted for a few short days. During these few days, Luo Fan had completely absorbed all the books and information that Evil Codex knew. In fact, he even vaguely concluded that apart from Evil Codex, there were some patterns that he could not find. In fact, from the many legends, it could be confirmed that the golden mist appeared with a pattern. After it appeared, it would usually cause a drastic change in the environment. For a period of time after the golden mist, the settlement would become even more stable. In fact, it could even be said that the appearance of the settlement was caused by the golden mist. At the very least, Luo Fan had been observing this world for such a long time, but he had not seen such a golden mist appearing anywhere else in this world. In this place, the golden mist had already accumulated so many legends. Under such circumstances, he did not believe that the golden mist had nothing to do with the settlement. But is there really another continent? This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Rationally, he did not dare to believe that such a continent existed. After all, this cataclysm world was truly too chaotic and dangerous. Even though there were so many villages in this settlement, he felt that it was rare. His rationality naturally could not accept the existence of a continent that was broader and could even form a country and give birth to an unbelievable cultivation civilization. However, emotionally, he was obviously looking forward to the existence of that continent. After all, as long as that continent existed, the truth of this world would almost be completely revealed to him. Once he was able to step onto that continent, he would be able to transcend this world and find the essence of the tribulation level through this world. All of this would be a step closer to him. The golden mist would only appear for a fixed period of time. However, for the residents of this settlement, and even for the buildings within, this time was completely random. According to the Book of Evil, the last time the golden mist appeared was 3 years ago. However, if he were to ask other people in this village, he would find that almost no one would say that the golden mist appeared 3 years ago. It was not that they were unwilling to tell this fact to Luo Fan, but according to their timeline, the golden mist did not appear 3 years ago at all. In this case, the time the golden mist appeared 3 years ago, as described by Evil Codex, was obviously not of much use as a reference. It could be said that the next golden mist could appear at the next moment, or it could appear infinitely far in the future. As for when exactly it would appear, it would depend on Luo Fan's luck, or in other words, it would depend on his location. The reason why Evil Codex was so eager to tell Luo Fan about this was not because he did not have a wish. What he wanted was to follow Luo Fan into the golden mist, explore the path, and search for that continent. Evil Codex was just an ordinary villager in Jiwang village. He was even weaker than the other villagers because he had buried himself in the illusory ancient books and legends. Without the help of others, it would be a suicide mission for him to leave the village, let alone explore the golden mist. Under such circumstances, although he had searched through many books and heard many legends, he had never once explored the golden fog. This had even become his inner demon, and he could not calm down for a long time. This time, Luo Fan's arrival was like a path to the heavens for him. Don't forget how Luo Fan had appeared. He had come in from the outside. Before this, he had not even appeared in the entire settlement plains. For such an existence, it was obvious that the environment of the outside world was not much of a problem to him. Walking between heaven and earth was obviously just his basic ability. Under such circumstances, exploring the golden mist was obviously not a problem for him. Chapter 2798. In the following days, Luo Fan was like a very ordinary villager in Jiawang village and began to live in the village. Of course, as a villager, he naturally needed to prepare his own building. After all, it was not a problem to use himself as a fulcrum to adapt to the dynamic balance of the surroundings in a short period of time. But if it continued for a long time, it would be inappropriate no matter how one looked at it. Since he had made the decision to stay in Zhuang village for a short period of time, Luo Fan naturally would not have the idea of distinguishing himself from the other villagers. Therefore, the building was naturally necessary. As for the building he created, it was like a world of its own, which greatly broadened the horizons of many villagers. They even felt that their perception of the world and the predestined world had undergone earth-shattering changes. Because of this, they changed their original plan to attack Jinghai village as soon as possible and bring out the greatest value of Luo Fan before he left as quickly as possible. Instead, they began to meditate and carefully experience the building that Luo Fan had created. It was because doing so could make them feel that they had gained more benefits. Subduing Jinghai village and making the territory of Jinghai village their new territory would indeed bring them a lot of benefit. It would at least double the resources of Zhuang village, so that each of the villagers could share the benefits brought by the increase in resources. But at the same time, it was also dangerous. After all, Jinghai village was not an empty place without any ability to resist. That village could pose such a great threat to Zhuang village before, and even made it difficult for Zhuang village to extend its tentacles out of the village. This was enough to show how powerful Jinghai village was. Now, although Zhuang village had an expert like Luo Fan, who seemed to be much stronger than before, who knew whether the strength of Zhuang village would be able to absolutely crush Jinghai village with Luo Fan's help before the real fight began. If something went wrong and their strength did not grow enough, how much would they suffer when they attacked Zhuang village? How much damage would they suffer? This kind of loss might be acceptable to the village. But for the villagers who had suffered losses, it was unacceptable. Therefore, at this time, when they found that the buildings built by Luo Fan could bring them enough benefits and help them improve enough, how could they still be willing to provoke a dispute and fight with Jinghai village? At the very least, before they completely digested the mysteries contained in this building and completely absorbed the benefits that Luo Fan revealed, they would never do such a foolish thing. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan was naturally satisfied. Although he didn't find it difficult to fight for the sake of his village, it was still a little troublesome. If he could avoid it, it would be best not to do it. At this time, it would be great if they could use this random building to replace the battle. Hence, he did not refuse any of the villagers' requests to view and comprehend his building. Even Zhan Wu had practically settled down in his building, and did not want to leave. Although it was just a building, it looked like an ordinary house at first glance. But in fact, the fact that a building could exist in this doomed world meant that it was extraordinary. Even though this building was located in a plain inhabited area, it was still the same. At first glance, this building looked like a bungalow, but if one looked closely, they would find that there was a huge space in the bungalow. It would be an exaggeration to say that this space was wider than a world, but it was definitely more than enough to accommodate tens of millions of people. Therefore, not to mention the fact that there were only hundreds of villagers in Jingwang village, even if there were millions of them, there would not be any pressure on this building. Because it was a building built by Luo Fan, the space-time rules in this building were naturally determined according to Luo Fan's wishes. At least, any villager who stepped into this building would naturally have a humanoid appearance that met Luo Fan's aesthetic standard. For Luo Fan, this kind of change made the creatures in his eyes more pleasing to the eye. However, for other creatures, it was like fixing themselves into the shape of a monster. After all, to them, a humanoid appearance was just a monster that did not meet their aesthetic standards at all. Fortunately, they were already used to entering other buildings that didn't conform to their aesthetic standards, so they weren't averse to the fact that they were transformed into monsters. Otherwise, perhaps not many of them would be willing to stay here. Because they were all in this building, the flow of time was naturally unified, and it completely followed the flow of time in Luo Fan's self-perception. In Luo Fan's perception, time flowed by slowly, and in the blink of an eye, 30 years had passed. For the villagers of Jiwang village, these 30 years were simply the best 30 years since they were born. In fact, it could even be said to be the best 30 years in Jingwang village's history. This was because during these 30 years, they could feel their knowledge growing at every moment. They could feel their essence improving, and they could feel their understanding of the essence of the world becoming stronger. This seemed unbelievable. After all, Luo Fan had previously understood the essence of the world through them, and understood the various phenomena of the world. However, now, he had turned the tables and allowed the villagers to benefit from him in this aspect. However, it was obvious that it was only natural for such a situation to occur. Luo Fan's realm was obvious, and his essence was clearly billions of times better than the villagers of Jingwang village. With this realm, anything in his hands would be far more effective than in the hands of the villagers. No matter what appearance appeared before him, he could use an extraordinary method to dig out the essence hidden within. It was the same for this world. Before this, the only thing that limited him was his understanding of the world, which was only the appearance of the world. Because he could not see the appearance of the world clearly, he could not dig further into the essence of the world. However, when the residents of the world sorted out the appearance that far surpassed what Luo Fan could see in front of Luo Fan, the deep truths and mysteries hidden under the appearance were no longer secrets to him. As for things that weren't secret, he could naturally reveal them as he pleased. This would allow the villagers, who could only see the surface, to gain a lot. On this day, Luo Fan suddenly had a thought, and exited the building that he had created. When he came out to take a look, boundless golden fog covered his entire field of vision. As far as the eye could see, both the sky and the earth were shrouded in golden mist. This fog was extremely dense. If it was not for Luo Fan's extremely shocking senses, perhaps the fog alone would have been enough to make him unable to see his surroundings clearly. It's finally here. After waiting for 30 years, the golden fog finally appeared in the world again. 30 years was not a long time for him, but when the answer was right in front of him, it seemed extraordinarily long. Therefore, Luo Fan did not stay idle during these 30 years. In fact, during these 30 years, he did not stop exploring the mysteries of the golden fog at all, as well as the mysteries of the path behind the golden fog. Wait for the golden fog to appear before exploring? He might have done this when his cultivation base was extremely low. However, that was clearly not the time now. To him now, as long as there was a trace of a clue, he would dare to expand it into a vast world. After knowing about the existence of the golden fog and the path, how could he not want to explore the existence of the path before the golden fog appeared, so that he could avoid waiting for an indefinite amount of time? After all, for someone as confident as Luo Fan, knowing about these was actually considered a rather obvious clue. However, it was clear that the profundity of the golden fog was beyond his imagination, and the obscurity of the path was also much greater than he had imagined. Under such circumstances, one could imagine how much he had gained in the process. Perhaps it was because of his exploration over the years that he had gained a deeper understanding of the inhabited planes, and his understanding of the essence of this world had also deepened. However, he could not find any trace of his true target, the path behind the golden fog. It was as if it was just an illusory legend that had no credibility at all. This situation continued until now, until the golden mist once again permeated the world. At this moment, Luo Fan stood in front of the building he had created and looked at the golden fog that filled the world. He knew that it was time for him to leave Jiwang village. At this moment, Evil Canon also discovered the appearance of the golden fog through his own means. Not long after, he rushed out of the fog and arrived in front of Luo Fan. After arriving in front of Luo Fan, Evil Canon did not waste any time and asked directly, "When do we start?" "Right away," Luo Fan replied calmly. He did not have any worries in Jiwang village. As for the help that Jiwang village had given him, it was more than enough for him to repay it with the building behind him. In fact, if one were to measure it with a stricter and more precise standard, Jiwang village might have profited. Under such circumstances, he naturally would not feel any psychological pressure to leave Jiwang village directly. Evil Canon was naturally overjoyed by this answer. He had already made up his mind a long time ago and made a choice between Jiwang village and his own curiosity. At this moment, he welcomed Luo Fan's decision with open arms. At this moment, Morning and the others seemed to have sensed something. They walked out of the building that Luo Fan had created and looked at Luo Fan reluctantly. For them, Luo Fan's body was equivalent to having countless treasures buried in it. Even if it was just a small amount, it would be enough to bring them huge benefits. Now that the treasures were about to fly away, how could they not feel reluctant? Time's up. As we agreed, I'm leaving. Luo Fan turned around and smiled at Morning. Although the tone was gentle, it naturally contained an unchangeable and unbending determination. Everyone could clearly feel how firm and unshakable the thoughts of the existence who spoke these words were. Morning opened his mouth a few times, but in the end, he could only sigh and say, "Take care." As he spoke, he looked at the building that Luo Fan had created behind him reluctantly. Even though he had experienced the building for 30 years, he still could not understand it. It was difficult for him to absorb the essence and mysteries within it. Now that Luo Fan had left, it seemed impossible to keep it. They would not have the chance to experience the mysteries within it. Don't worry, I'll stay here. Perhaps I can use it as a memory. Luo Fan smiled. Morning's eyes lit up when he heard that. With this thing, they could continue to experience it. Although it was much worse than leaving Luo Fan behind, it was already a blessing in disguise. At the very least, it meant that they could use this method to continue to improve. Thank you. Morning bowed at Luo Fan without hesitation to express his gratitude. Luo Fan did not say much. He merely nodded and entered the golden mist with the evil book. In the beginning, Morning and the others could still vaguely sense some auras leaving. However, they soon realized that they had completely lost all traces of Luo Fan and the evil book. Whether it was the aura or the sound, it was the same. Their surroundings returned to its original peaceful state of being shrouded by the golden mist. As he stepped into the golden mist, there seemed to be a mysterious force enveloping his body. It made Luo Fan feel like he was moving in the deep sea. What a mysterious mist! Luo Fan could not help but sigh after he entered the mist and studied it for a long time. This mist was quite subtle, but it was not like what Luo Fan had previously thought, where it had emerged from. In fact, the appearance of the two could even be said to complement each other. Neither could be dispensed with. Without the golden mist, the path might not have been formed. Without the path, the golden mist might not have been maintained. Chapter 2799. The golden mist's form of existence was extremely mysterious. It was not a physical substance, nor was it energy. It was not even space-time, laws, or worlds. It was a form of existence that even Luo Fan could not define. At this moment, the golden mist gave him the feeling that the world had suddenly turned into a golden cover. Upon hearing Evil Codex's words, Luo Fan nodded calmly. Naturally, he already knew about this when he was collecting information about the golden mist. Although the golden mist was said to be mist, it was in fact just an appearance. From a fundamental point of view, it had nothing in common with the mist itself. As soon as it appeared, it almost ignored all obstructions and covered everything in the inhabited plains. Under such circumstances, it could be said that the entire inhabited plains was within the golden mist. If there was anything outside the golden mist, it would probably be outside the inhabited plains. However, it was obvious that things outside the inhabited plains were naturally rather distant to Evil Codex. Therefore, the things outside the golden mist could not possibly be outside the golden mist in spacetime. Instead, it was the world before the golden mist appeared. In other words, under normal circumstances, the many living beings that appeared in the inhabited plains before the golden mist appeared would not be able to survive. The fact that so many villages could be born in the inhabited plains proved that the environment here was superior. Evidently, intelligent beings were not the only ones who could sense the superiority of the environment. Living beings without much intelligence might be even more sensitive to this than intelligent beings. After all, living beings without much intelligence relied more on their instincts, while intelligent beings relied more on their intelligence. As for their perception of the environment, it was obvious that their instincts were more sensitive. As a result, there had always been a large number of other living beings in the plains. In fact, living beings without much intelligence could be said to be the hunting targets of many villages in the inhabited plains. They were also a part of the source of resources. Even if these living beings without much intelligence were essentially the same as those with intelligence, the difference between them and not having intelligence had completely separated them, turning them into the hunter and the hunted. Being able to sort out the wisdom of the path of cultivation was a great advantage for those living beings without much wisdom. In the past, the unintelligent creatures in the plains did not pose much of a threat to the intelligent creatures. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that these unintelligent creatures were continuously gathering here from the outside world, they might have already wiped out all the low-level intelligent creatures in the inhabited plains. However, it was clear that the situation had changed due to the presence of the golden fog. The golden mist wasn't only effective on low-level intelligent creatures. Once the golden mist was born, those creatures would leap up from the bottom of the food chain to the top of the food chain. Before the golden mist appeared, they were nothing but prey to intelligent beings. However, after the appearance of the golden mist, they became much stronger and reached a point where they were superior to highly intelligent creatures. Once such a creature rushed into a village, it would be a huge challenge for any village. Because of this, once the golden mist appeared, the villages would activate layers of defenses to prevent the creatures from rushing into the village and destroying it. As for leaving the village and stepping into the depths of the golden mist to search for the illusory path, nobody would do that unless they were not afraid of death or had a shocking obsession. Of course, this didn't mean that these creatures were all the dangers in the golden mist. The creatures that had become more than 10 times stronger and leaped from the bottom of the food chain to the top were only a small part of the many dangers in the golden mist. In fact, it could be said that they were only an insignificant small part in the golden mist. There were even more dangers that could not be described with words, let alone recorded in information. Compared to those dangers, the creatures that could be found, resisted, and knew how to harm people were actually nothing. Of course, this didn't mean that they didn't need to care about those creatures. The reason why these creatures weren't much of a threat was because they were the easiest type of threat to understand and the easiest to defend against. However, it didn't mean that they could really be ignored. If they really ignored it, then what awaited them in the end was that they would die an unknown death not long after entering the golden fog. Of course, in reality, the threat of such creatures was the only threat that could be effectively defended against in the golden mist. As for the other illusory threats, even if one knew of their existence, one wouldn't know how to defend against them or how to avoid them before they appeared. At this moment, Luo Fan raised his senses to the maximum and tried his best to sense everything around him. All of his senses were greatly suppressed in the golden mist. Initially, he could see everything within a range of 100 trillion kilometers with just a glance. He could even grasp many secrets hidden in the depths of time and space within a range of hundreds of trillion kilometers with just a slight release of his senses. In fact, he could even distinguish all the scents within a range of 100 trillion kilometers with just a slight sniff. He could even use these scents to build a world of scents and see everything within a range of 100 trillion kilometers in his mind. However, at that moment, all of his senses were being suppressed to the extreme. Although it wasn't to the point where he couldn't sense anything outside of his body, The range of his senses had been suppressed to a range of only 10,000 kilometers from his original range of 100 trillion kilometers. This was like a person who had strong eyesight of 5.3 points suddenly discovering that he had become short-sighted and was thousands of degrees blind. In fact, the difference was even greater if one were to compare the shrinkage ratio. This was naturally a rather uncomfortable feeling for Luo Fan. At this moment, he felt like he was being locked up by layers of shackles. He felt extremely uncomfortable all over his body. The range of his senses had been suppressed by countless times, and he felt like he was being locked up by countless shackles. However, if Evil Codex knew that he could actually sense within 10,000 kilometers, he would definitely be extremely shocked and excited that he had chosen to explore the Golden Mist with Luo Fan. This was because Evil Codex's senses in the Golden Mist were even worse than an ordinary person's. Compared to Luo Fan, who could still sense within 10,000 kilometers despite being suppressed, Evil Codex could not see anything beyond 3 meters. He couldn't even hear the voices 3 meters away. 3 meters against 10,000 kilometers. The difference was so huge that it was enough to find a glimmer of hope in the impossible. A glimmer of hope to figure out the truth behind the Golden Mist and find all the secrets within it. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan was not interested in showing off his abilities to him, especially when he was being suppressed so miserably and felt extremely unhappy. A range of 10,000 kilometers was nothing compared to this plane. Although this plane was only an insignificant dot in this tribulation heaven and earth, it was still an insignificant existence. Its surface area was also calculated in billions of kilometers. A range of 10,000 kilometers was not much bigger than a dot compared to this plane. Naturally, there were many living beings within this range. At this time, these creatures had already undergone the inevitable changes of the creatures in the Golden Mist under Luo Fan's eyes. Powerful auras kept emerging from all over the place. These auras were so powerful that they could even be compared to ordinary creators of the world. Such a level of strength was enough to suppress 99% of the villagers in any village. In the past, such a massive aura would naturally be enough to make the surrounding villages vigilant. However, at this moment, Evil Codex still could not sense those living beings even though he was already within this range of 10,000 kilometers. To him, it was as if these incomparably enormous auras did not exist. They did not arouse his vigilance at all. Evidently, his perception of auras had been completely suppressed by the Golden Mist. At this moment, he could not sense the terrifying auras that were close at hand at all. Although Luo Fan was not in a good mood, he did not have the intention to directly destroy these living beings. Therefore, he consciously bypassed the locations of these living beings and explored other areas. With a range of 10,000 miles, he only needed to be in a certain location to be able to clearly sense everything that was happening in that location. He could naturally grasp the existence of the path and the abnormality that he needed to look for in an instant. Therefore, this kind of search did not require much skill for Luo Fan. Previously, he had already guessed that the Golden Mist had some kind of subtle connection with this plane. Since that was the case, the most likely location of the Golden Mist would naturally be a relatively special location on this plane. A special location on a plane was, of course, the easiest place to think of was the center of the plane. At this moment, Luo Fan had no concept of the existence of the path at all, and there was no information that could tell him where the path was. Therefore, he naturally went to the most likely location that he felt was the most likely. Although many aspects were suppressed in the Golden Mist, the suppression of strength was far inferior to the suppression of perception. Therefore, even the evil tome was quite powerful in the Golden Mist. At the very least, flying in the sky and burrowing into the ground was not a problem for him. Therefore, they naturally did not need to use their feet to measure the ground, and instead flew in the sky. In the beginning, Evil Codex could still know that he was heading in a certain direction, but he soon lost even this sense of direction. He felt that he had completely lost everything he could rely on, as if he and Luo Fan were the only two people left in the world. Apart from the two of them, there was only the golden mist. As for the location of the village, it had completely disappeared without a trace and could no longer be found. If Evil Dean was here alone, he could only resign himself to his fate at this moment. Even though he had already thrown caution to the wind and was determined to find the answer even if he had to sacrifice his life, Evil Codex could not help but feel a strong sense of fear in his heart, and his expression became inexplicably ugly. Luo Fan naturally did not care about the changes in his mentality. As he moved forward, his expression became more and more grave. The golden mist's suppression of his sense of direction was also effective on him, but his perception still had a range of 10,000 miles even after it was suppressed. The suppression of his sense of direction could not really make him lose his sense of direction. Therefore, the direction he was moving forward was completely under his control. In other words, he was heading toward the center of the plane. Under such circumstances, he should have been relaxed. But in reality, everything that he had sensed made him unable to relax at all. Everything in the retribution world was a tribulation trigger point. Whether it was a grain of sand under his feet, a living being like Evil Codex that was beside Luo Fan, time, space, laws, and even the golden mist that filled the world, they were actually countless tribulation trigger points that were constructed in various indescribable ways. The countless tribulation trigger points felt like atoms, neutrons, protons, electrons, or some other basic units in a certain technological world. Although their numbers were limited, the world that they formed was infinitely vast, infinitely complicated, and contained infinite mysteries. This had originally become common sense, and Luo Fan gradually accepted it. However, at this moment, as he moved toward the center of the plane and sensed more and more low-level intelligent living beings, Luo Fan discovered that things were gradually changing. The tribulation trigger points that made up many things seemed to be absorbing something frantically, and they were gaining indescribable growth. This growth made those living beings stronger and stronger, and at the same time, they gradually gained some characteristics that should not have appeared on them. Some characteristics that belonged to the tribulation trigger points. All living beings, without exception, were experiencing the same thing. It must be known that countless tribulation trigger points were changing at the same time. There were naturally countless possible outcomes from the changes of the countless tribulation trigger points. Chapter 2800. Is there something that's designing all of this? Luo Fan thought to himself, and his gaze became even more solemn. This kind of design made him feel extremely uncomfortable. In particular, he could not figure out the true essence of the design at all, and he could not see the context of all of this. This was because it would make him feel very powerless, even if it was a plane with a circumference of hundreds of millions of kilometers. It was not considered a natural mote for beings that could fly in the sky and burrow into the ground. Luo Fan and Evil Book continued to advance, and eventually, they were slowly approaching their destination. After an unknown period of time, Luo Fan was already about to see the center of the plane. Unexpectedly, but within reason, there was nothing unusual in that location. At the very least, there was nothing out of the ordinary at the center of that area. At a glance, it seemed like any other very ordinary area in the plane. Even the interaction between the various tribulation points was not more chaotic than other places, and it was not more stable at all. If it was not for the fact that Luo Fan knew that he would not find the wrong place, it would not be strange to think that this was any other place in the inhabited plane. The golden mist had lasted for a few months, and Luo Fan felt that it had already been a few months. During these few months, the living beings in the golden mist had already obtained great benefits from it. The highest level of the living beings did not rise to an unbelievable height. Compared to before, they had only risen by 1 or 2 levels. However, in terms of overall strength, the improvement of these living beings was extremely shocking. Usually, before the golden mist appeared, the most powerful living beings in the inhabited plane only occupied 1,000th or even a 10,000th of the living beings. However, after the golden mist spread for a few months, the proportion of living beings that had reached the level of the most powerful living beings in the past had reached a few tenths or even a tenth of the living beings in the past. Even those living beings that had not reached the level of the most powerful living beings had more or less improved, and all of them were very different from before. In this way, in terms of average strength, the living beings in the inhabited plane had risen by at least a dozen levels compared to before. Just this alone was enough to pose a huge threat to the many intelligent beings on the planes. Not to mention that there were all sorts of indescribable changes in the golden mist, causing the situation in the plains to be many times stranger than before. In fact, it was precisely because of this that Luo Fan and Evil Dean spent so much time to reach the center of the plains. If it weren't for all these obstacles, why would he need to waste these few months? It would only take a few days for them to arrive at their destination. Have we arrived? Evil Dean asked in surprise when he saw Luo Fan stop. Over the past few months, Luo Fan had been leading him on the road. Although they did not follow a straight line, they were constantly taking detours, turning corners, and even turning around occasionally. However, he did not stop for even a moment. It felt like everything was under his control, and none of the changes were out of his expectations. But now, after going on for a few months, he actually stopped. No matter how he looked at it, it seemed like he had reached a certain goal and arrived at a certain destination. Luo Fan said indifferently, "That's right, we've arrived at our initial destination." Evil Dean's eyes lit up, and he hurriedly looked around, trying to find something that could surprise him. However, it was a pity that he was being suppressed by the golden mist too much. His visibility was only 3 meters, and even the sounds and auras that he could hear and sense could only exist within 3 meters. How could he see anything with such a range of perception? It could be said that even if the abnormality was right in front of him, he might not be able to sense it, not to mention that there was actually nothing too abnormal here. Luo Fan did not pay attention to Evil Dean. He stopped at the center of the plane and began to carefully sense his surroundings. Although the central position was not where the path was as he had imagined, it was not as he had imagined. However, as the center of this inhabited plane, it was still a little special. Starting from this special place would make it easier for him to figure out some of the things he wanted to figure out. Evil Dean walked with difficulty and expanded his perception range to a radius of 6 meters. He circled around Luo Fan's position, but did not sense anything abnormal. In the end, he could only give up on the idea of exploring on his own, and obediently stay at the side like a salted fish. Luo Fan naturally did not care about Evil Dean's futile efforts. At this moment, he tried his best to stimulate his own perception to sense any possible abnormalities in his surroundings. To him, any abnormality here was worth paying attention to. The fact that there was no path in the center was not surprising to him. After all, if it was really only in the center, the secret of the path would have been discovered long ago. After all, even if one could not determine one's direction in the golden mist, it was not difficult to do so when there was no golden mist. If the path was really in the center, wouldn't the residents of the inhabited plane have been waiting in the center before the golden mist appeared? Even if this place was more dangerous and strange than the village, in order to explore the mysteries of that path and search for a higher-level settlement that might exist, there probably wouldn't be many residents who would reject this little bit of danger, but now the center was empty. There were no signs of human habitation at all. This was enough to prove that the road had long since been proven to be non-existent. Of course, this made him a little disappointed, but he could accept it. The fact that the path did not exist in the most likely location actually proved that the other possibility was rather high. The other possibility was that the path might not be in a fixed location, but it would only appear when certain conditions were met. Obviously, such conditions could only be created by living beings. What Luo Fan had to do now was to work hard to create that unknown condition. As Luo Fan spread out his senses, his aura gradually began to change subtly. It faintly began to resonate with the golden mist around him. It was as if he was fusing with the golden mist in some way. At this moment, he suddenly felt an indescribable pressure coming from all directions. This pressure was so obvious that he could not help but break free from that strange state. What happened just now? He frowned as he thought about it. He naturally still remembered that feeling just now. It was a feeling that he was being watched with all sorts of evil intentions. Suddenly, he had a thought, and he focused his senses on the many living beings that had gone through metamorphosis within the range of his senses. As he focused his senses, he suddenly realized that the way those living beings moved was already quite different from before. Previously, those living beings were like headless flies scurrying around their residences, as if they were survivors without a goal. However, now, the behavior of these living beings had completely changed, and they began to move in a fixed direction. That direction was none other than where Luo Fan was at the moment. In other words, it was the central region of the inhabited plains. Is it because this is the central region, or because I'm here? Luo Fan was bewildered. It was actually very easy to ascertain this. He only needed to leave this place. This central location was not the location where the path would descend. For him, this location was not that valuable anymore. Under such circumstances, leaving this place was not a difficult choice to make. Moreover, even if he left, he could still return if he wanted to. Hence, Luo Fan very quickly made a decision. With a thought, he called out to Evil Codex, picked a direction at random, and flew away. In the end, after flying for close to 1,000 miles, he stopped. After arriving here, he had already ascertained why those living beings had started to gather towards the central region. That was because he was in the central region. At this moment, he had left the central region. The direction of those living beings had clearly deviated, and they had started to move towards where he was. Moreover, the creatures that were doing this weren't just the ones within his range of perception. Instead, all the creatures in an even wider range were doing the same thing. This was because he had already deviated by more than 500 kilometers from his original position. This caused the range of his sensing range to change as well. There were areas that he had not sensed before that were now within his sensing range. The moment he sensed those living beings that were newly included in his sensing range, they were heading in his direction. In this situation, it was obvious that they had already taken this action before this. Seems like I can't avoid it. As Luo Fan thought this, a faint smile appeared on his face. Although this change seemed dangerous, it was very likely to be a breakthrough. There will be a battle soon. Be careful and hide yourself. Immediately, he said to Evil Codex. Hearing this, Evil Codex was shocked. What's going on? Is someone else coming? No, it will be the living beings that have been birthed by the golden mist. Luo Fan smiled faintly. Can't we avoid them? Evil Codex was even more shocked. In the past few months, he had not encountered any living beings birthed by the golden mist at all. He naturally understood that this was because Luo Fan had consciously avoided those living beings and tried his best to avoid coming into contact with them. In that case, since he could avoid them previously, why didn't he continue? Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, Perhaps avoiding them is the reason why I can't find the truth. At this moment, he felt as if there were countless rays of wisdom shining in his heart. Many questions that he had been unable to figure out before were now answered. If all of this is a design, why did the designer carry out such a design? Why did he want the living beings in the golden mist to receive such a huge boost? Why are intelligent living beings unable to benefit from the golden mist instead? The biggest possibility is that he needs these living beings to complete some kind of mechanism. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. As for the mechanism that was completed, Perhaps it was a test for intelligent living beings through these living beings? Evil Codex was stunned. All this while, intelligent living beings had stepped into the golden mist to explore, and it was clear that they had tried their best to avoid meaningless battles with the living beings in it. Although their efforts were almost never successful, ultimately they still worked hard in this direction. No matter how powerful an existence was, there was no exception. Fighting with those living beings was completely meaningless, and it would not bring them any benefits. However, now, Luo Fan actually said that this kind of effort might be a mistake. Perhaps they had to fight in order to reveal the secret of the golden mist, and only then would they be able to find the illusory path that existed in the golden mist to the settlement of the higher level. Just thinking about this possibility made him feel as if inspiration had exploded in his heart. The beings that left behind the path records seemed to have experienced countless battles. Those that I can't find at all seem to have some kind of special ability that can avoid battles. Evil Codex pondered, and his expression instantly changed. Just as Evil Codex was pondering, the living being closest to Luo Fan and the others had already arrived. That living being's power had increased by thousands of times after being stimulated by the golden mist. As it rushed over, the power within its body shook the surrounding space, and even caused some kind of strange distortion in the golden mist. Even though Evil Codex did not directly sense it, he could faintly sense that some kind of great disaster was about to befall. This situation was clearly caused by that living being's inability to perfectly control its own power. This living being's appearance was quite strange, and it looked as if it was formed by twisting the body parts of hundreds of living beings that Luo Fan had seen before. After appearing, hundreds of eyes shot out rays of light, wanting to pin Luo Fan down. At the same time, many of its limbs gathered a terrifying power that could destroy heaven and earth, and shrouded Luo Fan from all directions, wanting to crush him. At this moment, Evil Codex finally sensed that terrifying danger was approaching. Chapter 2801. In the face of such an attack, Luo Fan was not afraid at all. His expression was rather calm. At this moment, he did not even need to do anything. The tribulation triggering points around him were under his control in an instant. Immediately after, the extremely calm tribulation triggering points suddenly became violent. Amidst this violent movement, the tribulation triggering points triggered an unbelievably terrifying power that met the many limbs of the creature that was attacking them from all directions. Chi-chi-chi-chi, as strange sounds rang out, the creature's many limbs rapidly collapsed under the power of the tribulation triggering point. Its power was disintegrated in the blink of an eye, and the terrifying threat that made Evil Tone feel like the end of the world had arrived disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. The whole process was unimaginably straightforward and decisive. At this moment, Luo Fan did not pay attention to the creature that was attacking him. Instead, he focused his attention on the boundless golden mist around him. If his previous prediction was right, he would definitely trigger some kind of change in the golden mist after he destroyed the creature. After carefully sensing it, his eyes could not help but light up, because he'd already discovered to his astonishment that his previous guess was correct. The golden mist had indeed undergone some inexplicable changes because of his actions. However, perhaps because the changes were too small, even with Luo Fan's sensing ability, he could only sense that there seemed to be some changes. As for what exactly the changes were, he could not be sure. In the face of such a situation, how could Luo Fan not understand that it was because he had not slaughtered enough? While Luo Fan was pondering, those creatures did not have the moral integrity to wait for his response. While he was thinking, those creatures were rapidly approaching him. At this moment, there were already several more creatures nearby. The various abnormal phenomena caused by their terrifying auras had already affected where Luo Fan and Evil Tome were. Evil Tome was already shivering at this moment. The apocalyptic scene from before had yet to disappear from his mind, and suddenly, an even more terrifying phenomenon appeared. Moreover, it was the same phenomenon that he had no idea where it came from, and he had no idea how to resist it at all. How could he remain calm in this situation? Now that he knew that he was doing the right thing, Luo Fan naturally wouldn't be courteous to these living beings. At this moment, with a thought, the surrounding tribulation points underwent various indescribable changes under his control. Various terrifying powers were born under his control, and they surged toward those creatures again. Similar to what happened before, those living beings also lost all their power under the impact of the tribulation triggering point. They even lost their bodies and their lives. In the blink of an eye, the phenomenon that was even more terrifying than the end of the world disappeared without a trace. After sensing for a while, the changes in the golden mist became even deeper and easier to sense. However, it was clear that compared to what was truly displayed in front of him, it was still far, far away. Seems like I'll have to wait for a while. Luo Fan sensed the situation around him and thought to himself. Currently, the living beings that were constantly surging toward him within a radius of 10,000 miles were of varying strengths, but even the most powerful living beings didn't pose much of a threat to him. As for the weakest, he only needed to glance at them to get rid of them. Under such circumstances, he naturally didn't need to worry that those living beings would bring him any trouble. For him now, if he wanted to get rid of enough living beings, all he needed to do was wait. Since Luo Fan could be so calm, Evil Tome obviously couldn't do the same. For Evil Tome at this moment, it was like an ordinary person in a snake's nest in the boundless darkness. The movements of the poisonous snakes constantly wriggling around him entered his ears at all times. At every moment, he felt like he was already at the final moment and would fall into a deathly situation at the next moment. In such a situation, he was simply like a bird that was startled by the mere twang of a bowstring, and he reacted violently to any movements around him. If it wasn't for the fact that Luo Fan was by his side and that Luo Fan had always been so calm and composed, perhaps Evil Tome wouldn't have dared to stay here any longer. Even if the surroundings were golden and he couldn't see or sense anything at all, he would still rush in and choose a direction that he thought was safe to escape in. However, even if he didn't escape now, he didn't dare to be too far away from Luo Fan. He tried his best to get as close to Luo Fan as possible. It could be said that if it wasn't for Luo Fan's feelings, he might have directly stuck to Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan didn't care about Evil Tome at all. He just sensed the various subtle changes in the golden mist around him while constantly killing the living beings that approached him and attacked him. As those living beings were continuously killed, the changes in the surrounding golden mist became more and more obvious. Vaguely, there seemed to be some invisible existence approaching from behind time and space, or in other words, from outside the world, and was about to descend. As the number of killings increased, an inexplicable atmosphere gradually began to linger around Luo Fan's body without dissipating. This atmosphere came from the killings and the surrounding golden mist. More specifically, it came from the indescribable rules that created the golden mist. As the lingering atmosphere continued to linger, the living beings that were constantly approaching from the golden mist seemed to have sensed it, and many of them began to change their choices. Some living beings that were charging towards Luo Fan seemed to have lost interest in this place and stopped moving. As if they could no longer sense where he was, they began to scurry around in a daze. Meanwhile, some living beings that were initially moving at a steady pace seemed to have sensed an existence that was extremely attractive to them, and they sped up towards where Luo Fan was. Generally speaking, the living beings that stopped moving were relatively weak in terms of strength. In contrast, the living beings that did not stop moving and sped up to where Luo Fan was even more powerful. At the very least, they were more powerful than the living beings that had chosen to stay. Such living beings did not pose much of a threat to Luo Fan. At the very least, at this moment, Luo Fan did not change his attitude because of their different behavior. At this moment, he was still calm and even indifferent as he waited for those living beings to arrive. Time ticked by. In Luo Fan's perception, a few months had passed without him realizing it. On this day, after he smashed the last living being that had chosen to come towards him, Luo Fan knew that the change that he had been waiting for was about to happen. The golden mist in the sky seemed to gradually disperse at this moment. After the golden mist dispersed, what appeared was not the sky that was originally devoid of golden mist, but a path. It was a faintly discernible path that seemed to lead to another world, but also to the boundless sky. This path hung in the sky, seemingly within reach, yet also seemed to be far away. Is this the path? Evil Tome stared at the sky dumbfoundedly with an indescribable infatuation in his eyes. That's right. Evil Tome, whose perception was limited to a range of 3 meters, also saw the path that was hundreds of meters away from the ground. Obviously, the path itself was above the concealment rule of the golden mist. For this path, he had been treated with hostility and disdain by many villagers. For this path, he had tried to enter the golden mist again and again, but failed again and again. For this path, he had even endured the dangers of the end of the world time and time again. Now, after putting in so much effort, he finally saw this path that was criticized as ridiculous by others. The feeling of finally gaining something after experiencing so many hardships made him feel indescribably complicated. That's right, this is the path. Luo Fan let out a long sigh of relief. Judging from the reactions of the living beings that had stopped in place, they would either be able to enter the path directly, or they would no longer be able to enter the path by fighting the living beings like before. Let's go. Luo Fan smiled. His figure soared into the sky and flew towards the road. Evil Tome seemed to have woken up from a dream at this moment. He immediately responded and flew into the sky, flying towards the path quickly. The distance of hundreds of meters was actually covered by Luo Fan in just a billionth of a second. Even Evil Tome would probably need 1,000th of a second to complete this leap. However, the two of them had been flying towards the path for several hours, but they did not feel that the distance between them and the path had shortened at all. Even though the ground was already at least 10,000 kilometers away from them, the path that was originally only hundreds of meters away from the ground was still hundreds of meters away from them. It did not increase or decrease in the slightest. It felt as if their hard work over the past few hours did not exist at all. Looks like there's still a test. Luo Fan sighed and stopped his futile flight. At this moment, he finally understood why there were records of the path's existence, but no records of beings entering the path. Evidently, the existence of the path must have been caused by intelligent beings that had killed enough living beings for various reasons. As a result, the Golden Mist's rule naturally highlighted the path's existence. Or rather, it had been summoned. It was because of this highlighting or summoning that the intelligent beings knew of the path's existence. However, there were still some tests before the path, and the intelligent beings did not pass those tests, so they did not step onto the path. As a result, although the path had been seen, no one had stepped onto it. What should we do? Are we going to be stopped here? Evil Codex looked a little panicked and at a loss of what to do. It must be known that he was only able to come here and see the existence of the path because of Luo Fan. In fact, he did not do anything along the way at all. At this moment, seeing that the path was right in front of them, but Luo Fan actually wanted to stop, he could not help but feel indescribable panic. He was worried that Luo Fan would give up just like that. If Luo Fan gave up, he would not have any hope at all. Luo Fan only shook his head and said, "What we need now is to find a way. If we can't find a way, we won't be able to step onto the path even if we fly until the golden mist disappears." Evil Tome heaved a sigh of relief and said, "What should we do then? The information I've gathered doesn't have any description of this step at all. In fact, they could already be on par with the greatest achievements of all intelligent beings in history by reaching this step. Under such circumstances, they naturally could not refer to the experience of their predecessors. In fact, not to mention this step, even the actions that Luo Fan performed when he slaughtered living beings were mostly comprehended by his own wisdom, and not really based on the experience of those intelligent beings. Luo Fan only sighed and said, "We can only look for it ourselves now." As he spoke, he carefully sensed his surroundings, and his focus was on the path that seemed to be only 1,000 feet above them. Apart from the perspective of his eyes, he could not sense anything that could lock onto that path. It felt as if that place was nothing more than an illusory shadow, just an illusion of theirs. As for the golden mist around the path, there was nothing unusual at all, and it felt the same as anywhere else. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan could not help but frown. If there were any abnormalities, even if there were obstacles or sinister traps, it would be a good thing for Luo Fan. After all, if there were differences, abnormalities, and traps, it meant that there were clues. In contrast, there were no traps, differences, or abnormalities, which meant that there were no clues at all. For Luo Fan, who was looking for a test, this situation could not be any worse. There must be some abnormalities. Luo Fan took a deep breath and strengthened his confidence. Chapter 2802. The surrounding golden mist became more and more blurry in Luo Fan's senses, and the location of the path became clearer and clearer. This clarity was not because Luo Fan had discovered something, but because he was focused. The various scenes that originally existed there were highlighted. However, if an ordinary person saw such a huge difference, it would have exceeded the scope of gaining something. They would definitely treat it as some sort of epiphany. Many details of the path were continuously reflected in Luo Fan's eyes as the changes occurred. Many mysteries that were originally hidden gradually surged into his heart. The structure of the path itself was already extremely profound. Every rise and turn of the path, every grain of sand, every speck of dust, even the flow of air on the path, and even the changes in light and darkness contained complicated and indescribable principles. Just the path itself had already given Luo Fan the feeling that this was a vast group of worlds. At a glance, it seemed like an endless world was hidden in all the details of the path. At this moment, the light of the world around Luo Fan's body naturally produced all kinds of indescribable changes. The light began to produce all kinds of indescribable changes. In just an instant, it was countless times more complicated than before. Along with this change, the changes in pressure caused by the golden mist and the other tribulation points that were constantly eroding him were repelled. They could no longer transmit any pressure to his body. All the changes in pressure had been completely eliminated by the light of heaven and earth. Luo Fan could not help but be secretly surprised by this situation. It must be known that although he could originally use the light of heaven and earth to completely resist all the changes in pressure in the outside world, it was ultimately only possible because the light of heaven and earth had evolved in response to all the changes in pressure in the outside world. In other words, the reason why he didn't sense the changes in pressure wasn't because he was immune to them. Instead, it was because there was a light of heaven and earth that was constantly evolving in response to the outside world that was helping him resist all the changes in pressure. But now, the situation was completely different. At this moment, he felt that he was almost completely immune to everything. There was no need for his light of the world to evolve again to completely resist all the changes and pressure. Moreover, it wasn't just able to withstand it now. In the future, even if the changes in pressure became 100 times, 1,000 times, or even 10,000 times stronger, the light of heaven and earth would still be able to withstand it. It was as if the changes produced by the light of heaven and earth had far surpassed the scope of the changes and pressure in the outside world. This feeling of lifting something heavy as if it were light was secondary. More importantly, the appearance of this feeling actually represented a fact. It was very likely that he was already sitting on the right path. It was precisely this point that made him feel even more delighted. It seems that this test is very likely to be like this. Luo Fan looked at the path and thought to himself, Seeing the sudden change in Luo Fan's expression, Evil Codex was delighted. Did you discover something? The answer to everything is on that path. The way to step on that path also needs to be found on that path. Luo Fan just smiled and explained. Of course, this was all he could explain. Following this, if Evil Codex wanted to know more, he obviously could not provide it. After all, things like understanding could only rely on oneself. What Luo Fan had obtained was only what he had obtained himself, nothing more. Perhaps that would be the most suitable for him, but it was only suitable for him. For Evil Codex, that might be of some use, but he could not copy it. For something that was only of some use to Evil Codex, would he waste his endless energy to sort out the understanding and forcibly find a way to describe something that could not be described with words? He would not do such a self-sacrificing thing. Therefore, after Evil Codex said this, he did not get the many things that he wanted the most. Find it from that path. Evil Codex thought as he looked at the path in the distance. His heart was full of doubts and inspiration. His perception range was only 3 meters around him, but that path was hundreds of meters away from him. However, it was still hanging in front of him, so his perception range was not affected at all, and he could see the existence of that path clearly. At this moment, he was suddenly stunned. He thought that he suddenly found that Luo Fan had disappeared. Apart from himself, there was no one else within a 3-meter radius that he could sense. Luo Fan, who had been by his side, had unknowingly disappeared without a trace. Taoist brother Luo Fan? Taoist brother Luo Fan? Evil Codex exclaimed. In this position, without the protection of Luo Fan, he didn't have the slightest confidence that he could survive until the golden mist disappeared. Don't shout, I'm just in front of you. As long as you understand the key, you'll be able to catch up soon. At this moment, a voice rang in his ears. It was Luo Fan's voice. At this moment, from Evil Codex's perspective, he was the only one left in the golden fog. However, in Luo Fan's eyes, Evil Codex was only 4 meters behind him at this moment. 4 meters was already beyond the range of Evil Codex's perception range. He could not even hear anything, and he could not even sense the movement of the collapse of heaven and earth. However, to Luo Fan, everything was so clear that he could hear even the slightest movement. In this way, Evil Codex's previous behavior was obviously a little comical. At this moment, the voice that Evil Codex heard was not directly spoken by Luo Fan. Instead, he used his own power to send the voice within 3 meters before releasing it, so that Evil Codex could hear his words. Otherwise, even if he shouted himself hoarse, Evil Codex would not be able to hear anything at all. The reason why Luo Fan came here 4 meters ahead of Evil Codex was naturally because he had comprehended something from the path. His compatibility with the path suddenly increased, causing his body to involuntarily shorten the distance between him and the path. Based on the distance that was calculated in terms of tens of thousands of miles, he already knew that the distance between the path and the living beings was not really the distance between space, but a distance that was more subtle and mysterious than the distance between space. This kind of distance could not be bridged by space, but at the same time it could be bridged without space. Comprehending the key was obviously more important than chasing after it. Just now, Luo Fan comprehended some kind of key and became more compatible with the path. This made it so that he did not need to do anything at all. Just the resonance and compatibility between him and the path had already shortened the distance between him and the path. This shortening was the shortening of the distance between him and the path. It could be said that at this moment, Luo Fan and the path had already been locked together. Under such circumstances, no matter how far Evil Codex chased after him, even if it was hundreds of millions of miles, it could not shorten the distance. In other words, it was impossible for him to see Luo Fan again, unless, like Luo Fan, he could resonate with that path and increase his compatibility with it. Only then would he be able to shorten the distance between them and finally see Luo Fan again. Luo Fan did not care whether evil Codex could catch up to him or not. He had actually done his best by bringing evil Codex here, and he no longer had any responsibility for it. Next, whether evil Codex could set foot on the path or return empty-handed, it no longer had anything to do with him. At that moment, he no longer cared about how evil Codex would act. He only focused on comprehending the path above him and sensing the various indescribable, subtle principles and mysteries contained in the path. As he experienced this, he felt an endless amount of information being constantly dug out by him. It was constantly being absorbed into his heart, and at the same time, it was constantly being accepted by his light of the world, causing the light of the world to constantly evolve and sublimate. This evolution and sublimation made the light of heaven and earth become more and more complicated, and the light it emitted became more and more resplendent. At first, it was only a faint fluorescent light, but as time passed, the light released by the light of heaven and earth became as dazzling as a sun. The essence of the light of heaven and earth was light, but it was a more mysterious and profound light. Fundamentally speaking, the radiance emitted by the light was only a part of the light that had deteriorated and leaked out. It was the same for the light of heaven and earth. As light, the changes it produced in a short period of time were too great, too intense, and too fast. This astonishing speed of change caused some of the excess light produced by the light of heaven and earth to not have time to be reabsorbed by the light of heaven and earth. Instead, it was filled up by the structure that evolved afterwards, and in the end, it could only be released outward. What appeared was the endless light released by the light of heaven and earth. Of course, although this light was only an excess part of the evolution of the light of heaven and earth, it was still the light of heaven and earth. Its mysteries did not need to be mentioned. Wherever the light touched, time and space seemed to distort. The countless points of tribulation seemed to be targeted by the light in an instant. When they came into contact with the light, countless complicated and indescribable changes erupted, forming all sorts of incredible distortions. These distortions caused the space-time around Luo Fan's body to become indescribably chaotic. These chaotic distortions were only seen individually, but as a whole, the arrangement of these chaotic distortions was quite orderly. After all, these chaotic distortions were formed by the light released by the light of heaven and earth, so they naturally had to follow the trajectory of the light released by the light of heaven and earth. As Luo Fan continued to move forward, the chaotic distortions also continued to move upward. Gradually, a path was left behind Luo Fan. A path of chaos. Of course, it was similar to the Book of Evil. At this time, Luo Fan naturally did not care about the chaos he left behind. At this time, he was constantly experiencing the various mysteries of the path and sensing the endless principles contained within it. At the same time, the light of the world around him was also constantly evolving, constantly merging with the path above him and drawing closer to it. Under these changes, his figure was constantly moving upwards, getting closer to the path at every moment. In just a few short days, he had already crossed more than half the distance of thousands of feet. At this point, when he looked around again, he realized that the golden mist had unknowingly been left behind. If he wanted to see the golden mist again, he could only turn his head and look behind him. Only then could he see a boundless stretch of golden mist spreading out under his feet until it was beyond his sight. When he looked up, the surroundings of the path were no longer golden mist like before. Instead, it had turned into an incomparably deep and serene darkness. It was like the deep and unfathomable darkness of the universe. Compared to the darkness, the path was like the only light in the endless darkness, as well as the only hope. As for the Book of Evil, even though Luo Fan's senses had unknowingly returned to the state when he was outside the golden mist, he still could not see its existence at all. Even though he seemed to have only walked half the distance of thousands of feet and was only a few thousand feet away from the Book of Evil, He could not find its location at all. Behind him, where the Book of Evil was supposed to be, had already become the edge of the golden mist. He could only see the golden mist spreading everywhere. At this time, the light released by the light of heaven and earth on Luo Fan's body was no longer like the original sun. Instead, it was truly another sun. At this point, the countless tribulation points in the surroundings had already been touched by the light emitted by the Book of Evil. As if it was burning, it produced all sorts of incomparably shocking changes to resist the corrosion of the light. Such an intense reaction had completely surpassed chaos. However, there wasn't any hint of chaos, and it gave off a feeling as if it had been ignited by the sun. At this time, the Book of Evil, who was in the golden mist, could only see from afar that there was an indescribable light above him, between him and the path. Chapter 28:03. In the end, I still can't catch up. Evil Canon sighed, his heart filled with unwillingness. After such a long time, the distance between him and the path had not shortened at all. Even though he had tried his best to comprehend the various principles and mysteries of the path, and even though he had dug deep into the many secrets contained in the path, he ultimately gained very little. He could not even slightly shorten the distance between him and the path, let alone catch up to Luo Fan. Although Luo Fan had comprehended the various principles and mysteries of the path easily, in fact, even Luo Fan had only managed to do so with the help of the light of heaven and earth. If not for the light of heaven and earth, he might have been able to comprehend the same things and find the same mysteries. However, the time he needed to do so would definitely not be as short as he was now. If not for the light of heaven and earth, it would already be very impressive for him to advance a few feet. The existence of the light of heaven and earth did not allow him to comprehend things that he could not obtain on his own. Instead, it allowed him to comprehend things that he could have obtained at the fastest speed possible. If even Luo Fan was in such a state, Evil Canon's performance would naturally be worse, and not better. Moreover, Evil Canon did not have the light of heaven and earth to support him, so it was only natural that he would end up like this. At this moment, Evil Canon was also aware of his own limitations, and he knew that he had already missed the golden mist's opportunity to descend. However, even though he was extremely unwilling in his heart, he did not despair just like that. On the contrary, there was an indescribable fighting spirit burning in the depths of his heart. Although he could not set foot on the path, at least compared to before, when he was completely uncertain whether the path existed or whether the many legends were true, the current situation was already much better. After all, he had already confirmed the existence of the path and understood how to find it, and how to set foot on it. What he needed to do next was to reproduce what Luo Fan had done this time. Perhaps he was still very far away from Luo Fan's level, but as long as he worked hard, as long as he didn't stop, he would try a second time if he couldn't do it the first time. If he couldn't do it the second time, he would try it the third time. If he couldn't do it the third time, he would try it the fourth time. As long as he didn't die, he would eventually achieve his goal. With this thought in mind, he could calmly accept his helplessness this time. I hope you can successfully step into the world behind that path. Evil Tome looked up at the sun and wished it well. Luo Fan did not care about what was happening behind him. At this time, he was only focused on approaching that path. As he continued to experience the various principles and secrets of that path, his light of heaven and earth continued to evolve and adjust. Due to the evolution and adjustment of the light of heaven and earth, the light that leaked out gradually affected the surrounding tribulation points, then affected space-time, affected laws, affected energy, affected matter, and even everything else. This kind of influence was extremely strange, and it could not be described with words. Any adjective could be used to describe this influence, but no adjective could accurately describe the specific nature of this influence. As he sensed it, time gradually passed. Unknowingly, it seemed like several years had passed. The further he went and the closer he got to that path, the more complicated the evolution of the light of heaven and earth became. In other words, he needed to obtain even more comprehension, even more profundities, even more secrets, and even more principles from that path. Only then would he be able to take another step forward. As a result, he spent more than twice the amount of time to cross the latter half of the distance. Only after a few years did he manage to cross it with great difficulty and personally step onto that path. The moment his true body stepped onto that path, he felt his light of heaven and earth instantly spread apart and spread along the path. In the blink of an eye, it had spread to the end of the path and connected to an indescribable world. Or rather, it was heaven and earth, or perhaps it was just a special region in the world. At this moment, he clearly knew that this path was not a real existence. It was not a real path. It was nothing more than a template, or in other words, a gap. This kind of gap was a gap that needed to be filled by other existences, a gap that needed to be filled. Only by filling in and enriching it could he complete this path and make it truly take shape, so that this path could truly obtain its original function. At this moment, Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth surged into this gap and made this path truly take shape. If there's no light of heaven and earth, I'll probably have to use my own power. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he smiled in enlightenment. At this moment, Evil Tome, who was in the golden fog below, suddenly realized that the sun above had completely disappeared. The path that had been partially covered by the sun was completely revealed once again. However, compared to his original impression, there was now another figure on the path. It was a figure that he was extremely familiar with, the figure that had brought him from Jiwang village to this place. It was Luo Fan's figure. At this time, Luo Fan seemed so elegant, so mysterious, and his whole body naturally exuded a kind of perfect charm. At this moment, Evil Tome suddenly felt that this figure seemed to be the true perfect figure. His body also unknowingly began to move closer to Luo Fan's figure. Of course, his understanding of all things in the world had been accumulated since he was born, but he had yet to sort out his worldview. Therefore, no matter how similar his figure was to a human, it would not be able to completely transform into a human in the end. It was just somewhat specious. This situation was clearly a manifestation of his own ideas being influenced. However, at this moment, Evil Tome did not notice anything wrong at all. He only felt that his figure seemed to be much better looking and more perfect than before. Although it had not reached an absolutely perfect state, at this moment, Luo Fan turned around and seemed to glance at him. Then, he no longer cared about what happened behind him. He lifted his feet and walked along the path. In the blink of an eye, he had completely disappeared from Evil Tome's sight. As he continued to move forward and disappear, the path also began to shorten. It was as if he was bringing it along and disappearing into the distance. When Luo Fan completely disappeared from Evil Tome's sight, the path had also completely disappeared, as if it had never been there. Perhaps it's because I didn't contribute to all of this, so I can't comprehend the secret? Evil Tome suddenly felt a little doubtful. However, this doubt did not linger in his heart for too long. At the very least, Luo Fan had already given the best demonstration on how to set foot on that path. With such a demonstration, he already had a direction. From now on, the existence of that path was no longer illusory, and there was clear evidence. At this moment, the golden mist gradually began to dissipate. The restriction on one's perception had unknowingly disappeared. Evil Tome's perception of the outside world was also unknowingly no longer limited to a range of 3 meters around him. When his perception range recovered and he finally saw his surroundings clearly, his body could not help but tremble. What did he see? He was shocked to see many extremely powerful creatures surrounding him from all directions. The closest one was already more than 10 meters away from him, and it seemed like they could directly crush him with a single claw. I've actually been surrounded all this time? Evil Tome was horrified. He quickly soared into the sky and fled the encirclement of many terrifying creatures like a stray dog. In this inhabited plane, even ordinary living beings posed a significant threat to ordinary intelligent beings like them. Not to mention that the creatures surrounding him were all catalyzed by the golden mist, so they were several times more powerful than ordinary creatures, even a dozen times more powerful than ordinary creatures. Under such circumstances, being stared at by these creatures was enough to make Evil Tome fearful, let alone being surrounded by them like this. When he finally flew into the air, Evil Tome came back to his senses and began to think about what was going on. Although he felt that he had followed Luo Fan for tens of thousands of kilometers, in fact, when the golden mist dissipated, he still realized that he was actually still a few meters above the ground. The tens of thousands of kilometers that he felt actually did not exist at all. This was enough for him to feel a new level of mystery on that path. Moreover, those creatures were staring at him from the side, but they did not attack him at all. This also allowed him to guess that the mechanism of those creatures' attack mechanism might not be purely driven by pure instinct, but some more subtle mechanism that was guiding and controlling them. These two understandings suddenly gave him more confidence that he would be able to set foot on that path one day. After the golden mist dissipated, the plane returned to its original state, which was naturally much better than when it was shrouded by the golden mist. However, compared to Evil Tome, this environment was still extremely dangerous. At this moment, he did not dare to stay in this place for too long. At once, he carefully chose an extremely winding path and headed toward Zhaowang village. The village was the only place that he could rely on. Even if he could be considered to have fallen out with the village, compared to Evil Tome's uncertain encounter, Luo Fan had already arrived at the back of the path by following the light of heaven and earth. He arrived at the settlement that was said to be of a higher level and more stable than the inhabited plane in this tribulation world. When he saw the true appearance of this place clearly, he was already dumbfounded. What appeared in front of him was not a country, a city, a town, or a village, let alone a more prosperous civilization. Instead, what appeared here was a stretch of ruins. It was a boundless expanse that looked like a ruin that had encountered the end of the world and had been ravaged by fate. This is the so-called higher-level settlement behind the path? When Luo Fan saw all this, he suddenly felt that all his previous efforts were meaningless. This place was indeed much more stable than the inhabited plane from before. Moreover, this place was also part of the tribulation world, and belonged to the same world as the inhabited plane. However, in this place, he only felt a kind of loneliness, a kind of desolation, and a kind of extinction. Although it was a stable area that was as vast as heaven and earth, and it seemed to have an incredibly prosperous history. However, that was all in the past. It was only in the past. Now, all that could be seen here was wreckage, the wreckage of civilization, the wreckage of history, and the wreckage of life. It was just like the place where he appeared after coming out of the path. This place should have been an extremely prosperous city. Its area alone was as vast as hundreds of millions of miles. All kinds of buildings were densely packed together, leaving almost no space for such a vast city. It was obvious that this place was originally used to receive those who could pass through the path. But now, in this huge city, just like the other areas that Luo Fan had sensed, there was not a single building that was intact, and there was not a trace of vitality, let alone living creatures. The entire city was silent. The traces of civilization only gave it a sense of vicissitudes. Luo Fan frowned as he carefully sensed the city. He could see many traces of life here. In fact, the entire city gave him an inexplicable sense of familiarity. As soon as this sense of familiarity appeared, he began to carefully think about its source. Soon, he determined the source of this sense of familiarity. This sense of familiarity did not come from anything else, but from the structure of the buildings in this city. The architectural style of this city was naturally completely unfamiliar to him. It was a brand new architectural style developed by a civilization that he was completely unfamiliar with. However, the structure of these buildings had an extremely subtle characteristic. That was, the structure seemed to be convenient for certain types of creatures whose body structure satisfied and matched certain characteristics. The creatures that Luo Fan knew of were born with Taoism aptitudes. Is it a coincidence or something else? Luo Fan could not help but feel bewildered at this moment. Buildings were considered based on the appearance of creatures. This was something that any slightly experienced cultivator could tell. The size of the door, the position of the doorknob, the shape of the door lock, the height of the window, the height of the roof, the structure of the ceiling, the shape of the walls, and other details could all be deduced from these details. Chapter 28:05. Now that the Heaven Offering Mountain was complete, Luo Fan didn't need to prepare the terrain for the Heaven Offering Mountain at all, and he could start the ceremony directly. At that moment, he no longer hesitated. With a thought, he began to activate the many runes engraved on the Heaven Offering Mountain according to the method described in the remnant information. If the living beings of the original civilization of this world wanted to offer sacrifices to the heavens, they naturally wouldn't do it so casually. They would definitely have many complicated procedures, such as kowtowing, reciting various sacrificial texts, gathering the faith of many living beings, offering many sacrifices, and so on. However, for Luo Fan, it was naturally impossible for him to worship and believe in the so-called heavens like ordinary people. To him, even the entire simulated chaotic state was just a test born for his seventh major tribulation. This world of tribulations was just a place within the tribulation level of the simulated chaotic state. How could someone like him have any feelings of respect for the so-called heavens that existed here? If he didn't even have such emotions, the so-called worship and faith would naturally be even more impossible. However, those were obviously not necessary. Many other contents of the Heaven Offering Mountain were actually just simple rituals. The real key was actually to activate the Heaven Offering runes. As long as he knew how to activate these runes, even without the many rituals, he would be able to communicate with the so-called heavens and let Luo Fan see what kind of existence the heavens were with his own eyes. At this moment, countless runes shone one after another and continuously spread across the entire mountain, causing the runes on the entire mountain to shine brighter and brighter. In the end, in just a few breaths, all the runes on the entire mountain lit up. The density of the runes was already enough to make the mountain seem as though it was made of runes. Now that all the runes were lit up, it was obvious that this mountain had turned into a mountain of light, as if the mountain itself was glowing. The light was so dazzling and so subtle. The tribulation triggering points in this world, which were originally in a state of chaos, suddenly stabilized under this light. The world that originally lost its key support due to the loss of the tribulation triggering points of the world of laws, which made it feel like it was about to collapse, suddenly seemed to have gained an additional support. The feeling of imminent collapse disappeared in the blink of an eye. The changes were more obvious the closer one was to the sacrificial mountain peak. However, even if it was the least obvious, the place that was the furthest away from the Heaven Offering Mountain was still affected, and it was still changing for the better. Faintly discernible figures began to appear around the mountain peak. These figures knelt on the ground as if they were worshipping. The appearance of that figure was impressively humanoid. It was the appearance of the creatures that originally existed in this world that Luo Fan had deduced. As these figures appeared, indescribable praises continuously rang out from the crowd. In the beginning, it was only faintly discernible, making it difficult to determine if those voices truly existed. However, as time passed, the sound grew louder and louder, more and more obvious. In the end, it even resounded throughout the world. It was as if the entire world was resonating with this voice, and the entire world was praising along with this voice. The target of the praises was obviously the so-called heavens. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was on the heaven-offering mountain peak, sensed an indescribable power being released from the numerous runes on the mountain peak. It enveloped his body and even started to increase its strength, continuously pressuring him as if it wanted to crush him into minced meat. "It seems like I'm an offering?" At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly came to a realization, and he did not know whether to laugh or cry. He was at the highest point of the entire mountain peak, and the highest point of an altar was usually the place to communicate with the target of the sacrificial offering. It was also the place where the sacrificial offering was placed. However, he was currently standing there, and there was a powerful force pressuring him from all directions, as if it wanted to disintegrate all of his resistance. No matter how he looked at it, it seemed like he was being offered as an offering to the so-called heavens. If it was an existence on the level of the evil book, he would probably be crying and regretting his decision to stand in the wrong place. This was because this terrifying power was not something that an existence of that level could resist. However, it was obvious that the one here was Luo Fan. He was a terrifying existence that was many times more powerful than the evil book and the others. He was an existence that could crush the entire world with a single slap. How could such an existence be restrained by a small mountain peak? At that instant, as he sensed the power becoming stronger and stronger, a thought flashed through his mind. As his body struggled slightly, the power gradually collapsed amidst cracking sounds. Not long after, it was no longer able to get within 30 feet of him. At this moment, the praises around him became more and more hurried, and inexplicable dark clouds started to appear in the sky. An indescribable sense of oppression descended from the sky and suppressed Luo Fan's body, trying to subdue his spirit. Still trying to act mysterious. At this time, how could Luo Fan not know what was going on? A cold smile appeared on his face as he said this. In the beginning, it might have been the thoughts and beliefs left on the heaven-offering mountain by this world's civilization that were at work, creating this heaven-offering ceremony. In that case, it was obvious that it was not just the residues that were at work later on. The real residues could not have suppressed him so specifically. Later on, all the changes could only be controlled by another existence, and that existence could only be the so-called heaven. At this moment, Luo Fan no longer hesitated. With a slight tremble, he had completely broken free from all kinds of suppression and oppression. His body soared into the sky along with the force that he had broken free, heading straight for the dark clouds in the sky. In the blink of an eye, he had already entered the dark clouds. At this moment, he suddenly felt as if he had re-entered the golden mist. Although the color of the dark clouds was completely different from the golden mist, they seemed to be very similar in nature. When he entered it, it was as if he had entered another world. Everything around him was completely different from the world where the heaven-offering ceremony was held. Even his power and perception were under tremendous pressure at this moment. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and the heaven-offering light covering his body shook again. Countless changes appeared on the heaven-offering light in an instant. At this moment, the surrounding dark clouds seemed to have suffered an unimaginable impact and collapsed in large areas. After the collapse of the dark clouds, what appeared was not the world that he had entered, but the endless power of tribulations. When he lowered his head and looked below the dark clouds, there was only a vast and boundless world that flickered faintly like the stars at the end of the horizon. Moreover, it was becoming more and more distant with every passing moment. It was as if there was some kind of power enveloping the world and flying backwards, or as if there was some kind of power enveloping him and allowing him to rapidly advance. Without waiting for Luo Fan to see it clearly, the surrounding dark clouds once again converged, once again covering the sky and covering the earth, blocking his line of sight. He could only see the boundless dark clouds once again, just like how he could only see the boundless golden mist in the golden mist. This is no longer the world of tribulations. At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. The so-called heaven was not the power of the world of tribulations. Instead, it was some kind of power from the depths of the world of tribulations. It might even be some kind of power that simulated the depths of chaos. At this moment, the dark cloud that he had entered was actually connected to that power. Stepping into this place was equivalent to stepping onto the path to where that power was located. At the same time, he also understood why the golden mist was so mysterious, and why he did not see many things that exceeded his expectations after entering this world, nor did he see anything that exceeded his power's influence. The golden mist was probably created by the living beings in this world with the so-called heaven's power. Its essence might be similar to the dark clouds that Luo Fan had entered at this moment. This was the only way to explain what he had encountered in that world. At this moment, Luo Fan was rather excited. This situation meant that he was already on the right path. Although the many secrets of the world of tribulations were still shrouded in dense fog, there were still many secrets that he did not understand. But at the very least, he had accomplished his fundamental goal of entering the world of tribulations. He did not enter the world of tribulations to fully grasp the secrets of the world, nor did he fully comprehend the profundities contained in that world. He entered the world of tribulations to grasp the secrets of the world of tribulations, and even further, to grasp the secrets of the entire simulated state of chaos. Now, he had clearly grasped the traces of a power that he did not understand in the world of tribulations. What he did not understand meant that it was a secret. At the very least, it was a secret to him. Grasping this power clearly meant that he had begun to come into contact with the secrets that he did not understand before, and he had naturally achieved his goal. If it was before he came into contact with the golden mist, Luo Fan naturally would not have any effective methods to deal with the dark clouds. At the very least, he would not be able to deal with the dark clouds so cleanly. At the very least, he would need to spend a great amount of time and energy to cross the dark clouds. However, it was obvious that such an if didn't happen. He had indeed experienced the golden mist that was similar to the dark clouds. He had indeed understood many of the characteristics of the golden mist and grasped many of its secrets. Under such circumstances, the dark clouds before him were no longer a problem for him. At this moment, he did not even need to explore much. All he needed was a thought, and the light around him began to naturally change, bringing him to the depths of the dark clouds. The changes produced by the light of heaven and earth were not changes that were specifically deduced for the dark clouds at this moment. Instead, they were changes that had already existed in the light of heaven and earth before, and now they only needed to be summoned again to display various changes. Compared to deducing changes for the situation in the outside world, the speed was secondary. Most importantly, he could accurately grasp the key. The dark clouds in the outside world were constantly changing and evolving. If he really had to deduce them bit by bit and deal with the changes specifically, Luo Fan would probably have to slow down his speed by hundreds or even thousands of times to keep up. However, it was clear that the dark clouds would not slow down just because he slowed down. The more he slowed down, the more changes the dark clouds would evolve. This was like a race between two people. If one ran slower and the other did not change his speed, the distance between them would only continue to widen. If the slower one wanted to catch up to the other, the difficulty would only increase as time passed. However, if the two of them had similar speeds, the situation would obviously be different. If their speeds were similar, the final victory would depend on who performed better and whose luck was better. If he did not have the experience in the golden fog, Luo Fan would have been the slower one. And with that experience, his speed was equivalent to that of a runner's. As such, he was not shaken off by the evolution of the dark clouds. Instead, he closely followed the changes of the dark clouds, and the light of the world constantly changed accordingly, blocking the changes of the dark clouds. This allowed him to advance into the depths of the dark clouds without any obstruction. There was no concept of time in the dark clouds, so the time that Luo Fan sensed was only his own perception. If he thought that time was extremely long, then an instant in the outside world might be equivalent to countless years here. If he thought that time was extremely short, then billions of years in the outside world might be equivalent to an instant here. Chapter 28:06. According to Luo Fan's own understanding, he had spent over 100 years in the dark clouds before he gradually reached the edge of the dark cloud. Even with the light of heaven and earth accumulating many changes as a foundation, it still took him over 100 years to reach this place and see signs of breaking through the dark clouds. This was enough to show how difficult it was to break through the dark clouds under normal circumstances. Of course, the edge of the dark clouds was not like the edge of an ordinary material. There was no clear boundary that separated the dark clouds from the non-dark clouds. This borderline was actually an extremely subtle feeling that was close to an illusion. It was a feeling that the dark clouds were becoming thinner and thinner, and the blocking effect of the dark clouds was constantly weakening. The moment Luo Fan came into contact with this feeling, he knew that he was already close to the edge of the dark cloud. Perhaps he would break through the dark clouds in the next moment and enter a whole new world. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth on the surface of his body had unknowingly become completely different from before. His light of heaven and earth was extremely dim now, but there seemed to be billions of complicated and indescribable changes constantly being born within it. At every moment, there seemed to be countless times more complicated details constantly gathering and scattering within it. It looked like the most complicated machine in the world was operating. The essence of the light of heaven and earth was light. Although the light was dim, it did not mean that the light itself had become weak. Instead, it meant that the light was extremely restrained. For example, the reason why the light of heaven and earth was so dim was because all the light had been restrained within the light of heaven and earth. This meant that the light of heaven and earth had absolute control over the many changes that were happening within or on the surface of the light of heaven and earth. This was also because the light of heaven and earth had already completely grasped these changes. At this moment, it was merely retrieving these changes from the depths of its memories. This was because the light of heaven and earth had already grasped these changes. In fact, it could even be said to be a manifestation of a certain stage of the light of heaven and earth's operation. Naturally, the light of heaven and earth would not leak out because it could not control all the light. If the light did not leak out, the light would naturally look rather dim. The dark clouds gradually thinned, and faintly, an inconceivable existence gradually appeared in Luo Fan's senses. This existence was so vast, so enormous, and so profound. When it appeared in front of him, it actually made Luo Fan feel like he was facing countless complete worlds. Even with the light of heaven and earth protecting him, he actually felt an inexplicable sense of insignificance because of this existence. Luo Fan kept approaching that existence, and the surrounding dark clouds became thinner and thinner. Gradually, more and more tribulation power began to appear, gradually suppressing the surrounding dark clouds and occupying the main body of the environment around his body. That inconceivable existence stood towering at the center of the countless tribulations, and it was like the controller of the countless tribulations. It seemed like every single change would cause the boundless tribulations to give rise to a corresponding terrifying change that could overturn everything. Unknowingly, the dark clouds gradually disappeared. When Luo Fan came back to his senses, he found that he was already floating in front of that mysterious existence. His surroundings were already filled with the endless light of heaven and earth. At this moment, his light of heaven and earth had completely lost its dim appearance. Instead, it was like a rising sun, releasing increasingly bright and dazzling rays of light. The countless complicated and indescribable changes that originally existed in the light of heaven and earth had completely disappeared at this moment. What replaced them were the many changes that appeared on the surface of the light of heaven and earth. Although they were not as complicated as before, they were still complex and indescribable. These were the changes that occurred because of the endless light of heaven and earth. Amidst the endless light of heaven and earth, Luo Fan's figure was like a drop of water that had fallen into boiling oil, triggering an extremely intense reaction from the light of heaven and earth. Amidst this reaction, endless attacks poured down on him from all directions, constantly crashing against his light of heaven and earth, trying to completely erase the light of heaven and earth along with him. Looking around, he was clearly in the depths of the light of heaven and earth. There was no trace of the light of heaven and earth, the many simulated chaotic layers below the light of heaven and earth. It felt like he had entered a mysterious place similar to a simulated chaotic state, and the endless light of heaven and earth, he saw, was actually replacing the many chaotic factors in the simulated chaotic state. After looking around, Luo Fan finally focused his attention on the existence in front of him that the beings in the light of heaven and earth regarded as heaven. It was a force. It was an incomparably mysterious power that stood above everything in the world of tribulations. It was even a force that surpassed the endless light of heaven and earth in the light of heaven and earth. At this time, this power was quietly curled up in his depths. It didn't have the slightest reaction to his appearance. It was as if Luo Fan didn't exist and was still quietly curled up. Or perhaps it didn't have the ability to react. This force was so huge, so vast, so wonderful, and so unbelievable. Although it was just a surge of energy, it had completely suppressed all the tribulations around it. Even if the countless tribulations tried to destroy it and pounce towards it, it was still the same. No matter what kind of light of heaven and earth it was, no matter how many light of heaven and earth pounced on it, it wasn't shaken at all. Facing the arrival of those light of heaven and earth, the light of heaven and earth, the light of heaven and earth, had completely crushed all the light of heaven and earth that came into contact with it, causing all the light of heaven and earth to dissipate without any effect. Compared to Luo Fan's light of the heavens and earth, which required endless changes to counter the power of the corresponding tribulation in order to block it, it was much easier for Luo Fan, who was within it, to not be injured by the power. Suppress? Isn't this the core of the light of heaven and earth? Luo Fan looked at all of this with doubt in his heart. Although he wasn't sure if this was the core of the light of heaven and earth, there was no doubt that this was the deepest part of the light of heaven and earth. The force that existed here could extend its tentacles to the surface of the light of heaven and earth. Normally speaking, it should be some kind of power in the light of heaven and earth, or even the core of the light of heaven and earth. However, if it really was the core of the light of heaven and earth, then it should have some kind of relationship with the endless light of heaven and earth. In other words, for this force, the endless light of heaven and earth in the light of heaven and earth should have a supportive effect on this force. Even if it couldn't improve this force, it should at least coexist with it peacefully. It was the same for the light of heaven and earth. Even if it couldn't benefit from this force, it should be normal for it to not be harmed by this force. However, at this moment, the relationship between this force and the endless light of heaven and earth was that they were opposing each other. The light of heaven and earth wanted to attack that force, and that force wanted to suppress the light of heaven and earth. It was like a pair of irreconcilable enemies. This situation clearly contradicted Luo Fan's original guess that this force might be the core of the light of heaven and earth. How could Luo Fan not be surprised? This force was so mysterious that it had actually surpassed the scope of words. Even though Luo Fan had already appeared in front of this power, seen it with his own eyes, and felt it personally, he still couldn't truly describe what this power looked like, nor could he truly describe the characteristics of this power. At this moment, he could only feel that the force before him was coiled up and almost completely ignoring the endless light of heaven and earth. As for what was inside the force, whether it was the same as it looked on the surface, whether it was pure, and so on, he had no idea. Even if he wanted to measure this force with a certain color, it was impossible. With a thought, Luo Fan slowly moved forward under the protection of the light of heaven and earth, and gradually approached that force. When he passed through the dark clouds, he had clearly obtained the qualification to truly come into contact with that force. It was just like how he had obtained the qualification to step onto that path after passing through the barrier between him and the path in the light of heaven and earth. Therefore, he didn't need to go through any tests to approach that force at this moment. The force didn't obstruct him at all, allowing his body to constantly approach that force. Unknowingly, he had already reached the surface of that force and reached the point where he could touch it with his tentacles. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth around him gradually returned to its original state of being as clear as water and as lively as a living creature. However, the endless light of heaven and earth had completely ignored him, as if he didn't exist and didn't attack him at all. There's such a benefit? At this moment, all sorts of subtle thoughts suddenly appeared in Luo Fan's mind. If this power had such a property, then perhaps he wasn't the only one around this power. Life was an incredible existence. As long as there was a trace of possibility for it to exist, life would be born. No matter how harsh the environment was, no matter how small the possibility was, as long as there was a possibility, life would definitely exist. On the surface, this force was the only existence in the light of heaven and earth that could ignore the light of heaven and earth and not be destroyed by the light of heaven and earth. Clearly, it met the requirements of life. Therefore, if there was life here, Luo Fan wouldn't be surprised at all. After realizing this possibility, Luo Fan began to carefully sense the surroundings at this moment. This force was an existence that was even above the light of heaven and earth, and the light of heaven and earth was already above the simulation of the primal chaos. It was even above the simulation of the primal chaos. With such a deduction, one would naturally know that for this force, spacetime and heaven and earth were obviously just playthings. As the surface of this power, it was clearly impossible for it to be as simple as it appeared. In fact, on the surface of this force, spacetime actually existed in an extremely mysterious way. Every position on the surface of this force was in an extremely special state between endless spacetime and non-existence of any spacetime. In other words, when looking from the outside, one couldn't be sure if there was no spacetime and it was just the surface of the force, or if there was endless spacetime, countless spaces, or even endless worlds within it. Even where Luo Fan was at this moment was the same. This force gave Luo Fan a huge and boundless feeling. In fact, it wasn't that this force was really that huge and boundless. In fact, this force that surpassed spacetime had no concept of size or quantity. This kind of vastness was like the flow of time that Luo Fan felt in a place where there was no time. That was completely Luo Fan's perception, it was his own feeling. He felt that this power was much stronger than him. This power was enormous, it was boundless. If he felt that this force was weaker than him, then it would give him a feeling that it wasn't weak, and it was passable. Therefore, at this moment, when Luo Fan realized that this force might have endless spacetime, endless worlds, and boundless heaven and earth, this force suddenly expanded in his perception by tens of thousands of times. This made him, who couldn't explore the boundaries of this force, feel that this force had become even more boundless. In the face of this force, even if it was just the surface of this force, Luo Fan's perception was no longer very effective.